Section 41. Dasein's being as care. Since our aim is to grasp the totality of this structural whole ontologically, we must first ask whether the phenomenon of anxiety and that which is disclosed in it can give us the whole of Dasein in a way which is phenomenally equiprimordial, and whether they can do so in such a manner that, if we look searchingly at this totality, our view of it will be filled in by what has thus been given us. The entire stock of what lies therein may be counted up formally and recorded. Anxiousness, as a state of mind, is a way of being in the world. That in the face of which we have anxiety is thrown being in the world. That which we have anxiety about is our potentiality for being in the world. Thus the entire phenomenon of anxiety shows Dasein as factically existing being in the world. The fundamental ontological characteristics of this entity are existentiality, facticity, and being fallen. These existential characteristics are not pieces belonging to something composite, one of which might sometimes be missing, but there is woven together in them a primordial context, which makes up that totality of the structural whole which we are seeking. In the unity of those characteristics of Dasein's being which we have mentioned, this being becomes something which it is possible for us to grasp as such ontologically. How is this unity itself to be characterized? Dasein is an entity for which, in its being, that being is an issue. The phrase is an issue has been made plain in the state of being of understanding as self-projective being towards its ownmost potentiality for being. This potentiality is that for the sake of which any Dasein is as it is. In each case, Dasein has already compared itself in its being with the possibility of itself, being free for one's ownmost potentiality for being, and therewith for the possibility of authenticity and inauthenticity, is shown with a primordial elemental concreteness in anxiety. But ontologically, being toward one's ownmost potentiality for being means that in each case Dasein is already ahead of itself, ihm selbst vorweg, in its being. Dasein is always beyond itself, über sich hinaus, not as a way of behaving towards other entities which it is not, but as being towards the potentiality for being which it is itself. This structure of being, which belongs to the essential is an issue, we shall denote as Dasein's being ahead of itself. But this structure pertains to the whole of Dasein's constitution. Being ahead of itself does not signify anything like an isolated tendency in a worldless subject, but characterizes being in the world. To being in the world, however, belongs the fact that it has been delivered over to itself, that it has in each case already been thrown into a world. The abandonment of Dasein to itself is shown with primordial concreteness in anxiety. Being ahead of itself means, if we grasp it more fully, ahead of itself in already being in a world. As soon as this essentially unitary structure is seen as a phenomenon, what we have set forth earlier in our analysis of worldhood also becomes plain. The upshot of that analysis was that the referential totality of significance, which as such is constitutive for worldhood, has been tied up with a for the sake of which. The fact that this referential totality of the manifold relations of the in order to has been bound up with that which is an issue for Dasein does not signify that a world of objects which is present at hand has been welded together with a subject. It is rather the phenomenal expression of the fact that the constitution of Dasein, whose totality is now brought out explicitly as ahead of itself in being already in, is primordially a whole. To put it otherwise, existing is always factical. Existentiality is essentially determined by facticity. Furthermore, Dasein's factical existing is not only generally and without further differentiation a thrown potentiality for being in the world. It is always also absorbed in the world of its concern. In this falling being alongside, fleeing in the face of uncanniness, which for the most part remains concealed with latent anxiety, since the publicness of the they suppresses everything unfamiliar, announces itself whether it does so explicitly or not, and whether it is understood or not. Ahead of itself being already in a world essentially includes one's falling and one's being alongside, those things ready to hand within the world with which one concerns oneself. The formerly existential totality of Dasein's ontological structural whole must therefore be grasped in the following structure. The being of Dasein means ahead of itself being already in the world, as being alongside entities encountered within the world. This being fills in the signification of the term care, Sorge, which is used in a purely ontologico-existential manner. From this signification, every tendency of being which one might have in mind ontically, such as worry, Besorgnis, or carefreeness, Sorglosigkeit, is ruled out. Because being in the world is essentially care, being alongside the ready-to-hand could be taken in our previous analyses as concern, and being with the Dasein with of others, as we encounter it within the world, could be taken as solicitude. Being alongside something is concern because it is defined as a way of being in by its basic structure, care. Care does not characterize just existentiality, let us say, as detached from facticity and falling. On the contrary, it embraces the unity of these ways in which being may be characterized. So neither does care stand primarily and exclusively for an isolated attitude of the I towards itself. If one were to construct the expression care for oneself, Selbstsorge, following the analogy of concern, Besorgen, and solicitude, Fürsorge, this would be a tautology. Care cannot stand for some special attitude towards the self, for the self has already been characterized ontologically by being ahead of itself, a characteristic in which the other two items in the structure of care, being already in and being alongside, have been jointly posited, mitgesetzt. In being ahead of oneself as being towards one's ownmost potentiality for being, lies the existential ontological condition for the possibility of being free, for authentic existentielle possibilities. For the sake of its potentiality for being, any Dasein is as it factically is. But to the extent that this being towards its potentiality for being is itself characterized by freedom, Dasein can comport itself towards its possibilities even unwillingly. It can be inauthentically, and factically it is inauthentically, proximally and for the most part, the authentic for the sake of which has not been taken hold of. The projection of one's own potentiality for being has been abandoned to the disposal of the they. Thus, when we speak of being ahead of itself, the itself which we have in mind is in each case the self in the sense of the they-self. Even in inauthenticity, Dasein remains essentially ahead of itself, just as Dasein's fleeing in the face of itself as it falls still shows that it has the state of being of an entity for which its being is an issue. Care, as a primordial structural totality, lies before, for, every factical attitude and situation of Dasein, and it does so existentially a priori. This means that it always lies in them. So this phenomenon by no means expresses a priority of the practical attitude over the theoretical. When we ascertain something present at hand by merely beholding it, this activity has the character of care just as much as does a political action, or taking a rest and enjoying oneself. Theory and practice are possibilities of being for an entity whose being must be defined as care. The phenomenon of care in its totality is essentially something that cannot be torn asunder. So any attempts to trace it back to special acts or drives, like willing and wishing, or urge and addiction, or to construct it out of these will be unsuccessful. Willing and wishing are rooted with ontological necessity in Dasein as care. They're not just ontologically undifferentiated experiences occurring in a stream, which is completely indefinite with regard to the meaning of its being. This is no less the case with urge and addiction. These too are grounded in care so far as they can be exhibited in Dasein at all. This does not prevent them from being ontologically constitutive, even for entities that merely live. But the basic ontological state of living is a problem in its own right, and can be tackled only reductively and privatively in terms of the ontology of Dasein. Care is ontologically earlier than the phenomena we have just mentioned, which admittedly can, within certain limits, always be described appropriately without our needing to have the full ontological horizon visible, or even to be familiar with it at all. From the standpoint of our present investigation in fundamental ontology, which aspires neither to a thematically complete ontology of Dasein, nor even to a concrete anthropology, it must suffice to suggest how these phenomena are grounded existentially in care. That very potentiality for being, for the sake of which Dasein is, has being in the world as its kind of being. Thus it implies ontologically a relation to entities within the world. Care is always concern and solicitude, even if only privatively. In willing, an entity which is understood, that is, one which has been projected upon its possibility, gets seized upon, either as something with which one may concern oneself, or as something which is to be brought into its being through solicitude. Hence to any willing there belongs something willed, which has already made itself definite in terms of a for the sake of which. If willing is to be possible ontologically, the following items are constitutive for it. 1. The prior disclosedness of the for the sake of which in general, being ahead of itself. 2. The disclosedness of something with which one can concern oneself, the world as the wherein of being already. 3. Dasein's projection of itself understandingly upon a potentiality for being towards a possibility of the entity willed. In the phenomenon of willing, the underlying totality of care shows through. As something factical, Dasein's projection of itself understandingly is in each case already alongside a world that has been discovered. From this world it takes its possibilities, and it does so first in accordance with the way things have been interpreted by the they. This interpretation has already restricted the possible options of choice to what lies within the range of the familiar, the attainable, the respectable, that which is fitting and proper. This levelling off of Dasein's possibilities to what is proximally at its everyday disposal also results in a dimming down of the possible as such. The average everydayness of concern becomes blind to its possibilities and tranquilizes itself with that which is merely actual. This tranquilizing does not rule out a high degree of diligence in one's concern, but arouses it. In this case, no positive new possibilities are willed, but that which is at one's disposal becomes tactically altered in such a way that there is a semblance of something happening. All the same, this tranquilized willing under the guidance of the they does not signify that one's being towards one's potentiality for being has been extinguished, but only that it has been modified. In such a case, one's being towards possibilities shows itself for the most part as mere wishing. In the wish, Dasein projects its being upon possibilities which not only have not been taken hold of in concern, but whose fulfillment has not even been pondered over and expected. On the contrary, in the mode of mere wishing, the ascendancy of being ahead of oneself brings with it a lack of understanding for the factical possibilities. When the world has been primarily projected as a wish world, being in the world has lost itself inertly in what is at its disposal. But it has done so in such a way that, in the light of what is wished for, that which is at its disposal, and this is all that is ready to hand, is never enough. Wishing is an existential modification of projecting oneself understandingly. When such self-projection has fallen forfeit to thrownness and just keeps hankering after possibilities, such hankering closes off the possibilities. What is there in wishful hankering turns into the actual world. Ontologically, wishing presupposes care. In hankering, being already alongside takes priority. The ahead of itself in being already in is correspondingly modified. Dasein's hankering, as it falls, makes manifest its addiction to becoming lived by whatever world it is in. This addiction shows the character of being out for something, Ausseins auf. Being ahead of oneself has lost itself in a just always already alongside. What one is addicted towards, das hinzu des Hanges, is to let oneself be drawn by the sort of thing for which the addiction hankers. If Dasein, as it were, sinks into an addiction, then there is not merely an addiction present at hand, but the entire structure of care has been modified. Dasein has become blind and puts all possibilities into the service of the addiction. On the other hand, the urge to live is something towards which one is impelled, and it brings the impulsion along with it of its own accord. It is towards this at any price. The urge seeks to crowd out, verdrängen, other possibilities. Here too the being ahead of oneself is one that is inauthentic, even if one is assailed by an urge coming from the very thing that is urging one on. The urge can outrun one's current state of mind and one's understanding. But then Dasein is not, and never is, a mere urge to which other kinds of controlling or guiding behavior are added from time to time. Rather, as a modification of the entirety of being in the world, it is always care already. In pure urge, care has not yet become free, though care first makes it ontologically possible for Dasein to be urged on by itself. In addiction, however, care has always been bound. Addiction and urge are possibilities rooted in the thrownness of Dasein. The urge to live is not to be annihilated. The addiction to becoming lived by the world is not to be rooted out. But because these are both grounded ontologically in care, and only because of this, they are both to be modified in an ontical and existentiel manner by care as something authentic. With the expression care, we have in mind a basic existential ontological phenomenon, which all the same is not simple in its structure. The ontologically elemental totality of the care structure cannot be traced back to some ontical primal element, just as being certainly cannot be explained in terms of entities. In the end, it will be shown that the idea of being in general is just as far from being simple as is the being of Dasein. In defining care as being ahead of oneself, in being already in, as being alongside, we have made it plain that even this phenomenon is, in itself, still structurally articulated. But is this not a phenomenal symptom that we must pursue the ontological question even further until we can exhibit a still more primordial phenomenon which provides the ontological support for the unity and the totality of the structural manifoldness of care? Before we follow up this question, we must look back and appropriate with greater precision what we have hitherto interpreted in aiming at the question of fundamental ontology as to the meaning of being in general. First, however, we must show that what is ontologically new in this interpretation is ontically quite old. In explicating Dasein's being as care, we are not forcing it under an idea of our own contriving, but we are conceptualizing existentially what has already been disclosed in an ontico-existentiel manner. Section 42. Confirmation of the existential interpretation of Dasein as care in terms of Dasein's pre-ontological way of interpreting itself. In our foregoing interpretations, which have finally led to exhibiting care as the being of Dasein, everything depended on our arriving at the right ontological foundations for that entity, which in each case we ourselves are, and which we call man. To do this, it was necessary from the outset to change the direction of our analysis from the approach presented by the traditional definition of man, an approach which has not been clarified ontologically and is in principle questionable. In comparison with this definition, the existential ontological interpretation may seem strange, especially if care is understood just ontically as worry or grief, als Besorgnis und Bekümmernis. Accordingly, we shall now cite a document which is pre-ontological in character, even though its demonstrative force is merely historical. We must bear in mind, however, that in this document, Dasein is expressing itself primordially, unaffected by any theoretical interpretation, and without aiming to propose any. We must also note that Dasein's being is characterized by historicality, though this must first be demonstrated ontologically. If Dasein is historical in the very depths of its being, then a deposition, Aussage, which comes from its history and goes back to it, and which, moreover, is prior to any scientific knowledge, will have a special weight, even though its importance is never purely ontological. That understanding of being which lies in Dasein itself expresses itself pre-ontologically. The document which we are about to cite should make plain that our existential interpretation is not a mere fabrication, but that as an ontological construction it is well grounded and has been sketched out beforehand in elemental ways. There is an ancient fable in which Dasein's interpretation of itself as care has been embedded. Once, when Care was crossing a river, she saw some clay. She thoughtfully took up a piece and began to shape it. While she was meditating on what she had made, Jupiter came by. Care asked him to give it spirit, and this he gladly granted. But when she wanted her name to be bestowed upon it, he forbade this, and demanded that it be given his name instead. While Care and Jupiter were disputing, Earth arose and desired that her own name be conferred on the creature, since she had furnished it with part of her body. They asked Saturn to be their arbiter, and he made the following decision, which seemed a just one. Since you, Jupiter, have given its spirit, you shall receive that spirit at its death, and since you, Earth, have given its body, you shall receive its body. But since Care first shaped this creature, she shall possess it as long as it lives. And because there is now a dispute among you as to its name, let it be called Homo, human, for it is made out of humus, earth. This pre-ontological document becomes especially significant not only in that Care is here seen as that to which human Dasein belongs, for its lifetime, but also because this priority of Care emerges in connection with the familiar way of taking man as compounded of body, earth, and spirit. Cura prima finxit. Care first formed it. In Care this entity has the source of its being. Cura teneat, quam diu vixerit. Let Care hold, keep it as long as it lives. The entity is not released from this source, but is held fast, dominated by it through and through as long as this entity is in the world. Being in the world has the stamp of Care, which accords with its being. It gets the name Homo, human, not in consideration of its being, but in relation to that of which it consists, humus. The decision as to wherein the primordial being of this creature is to be seen is left to Saturn, time. Thus, the pre-ontological characterization of man's essence expressed in this fable has brought to view in advance the kind of being which dominates his temporal sojourn in the world, and does so through and through. The history of the signification of the ontical concept of Care permits us to see still further basic structures of Dasein. Burdach calls attention to a double meaning of the term cura, according to which it signifies not only anxious exertion, but also carefulness and devotedness, Sorgfalt, Hingabe. Thus Seneca writes in his last epistle, "Among the four existent natures, trees, beasts, man and God, the latter two, which alone are endowed with reason, are distinguished in that God is immortal while man is mortal. Now when it comes to these, the good of the one, namely God, is fulfilled by his nature, but that of the other, man, is fulfilled by care, cura. Unius bonum natura perficit, Dei scilicet Alterius cura hominis. Man's perfectio, his transformation into that which he can be in being free for his ownmost possibilities, projection, is accomplished by care. But with equal primordiality, care determines what is basically specific in this entity, according to which it has been surrendered to the world of its concern, thrownness. In the double meaning of care, what we have in view is a single basic state in its essentially twofold structure of thrown projection. As compared with this ontical interpretation, the existential ontological interpretation is not, let us say, merely an ontical generalization which is theoretical in character. That would just mean that ontically all man's ways of behaving are full of care, and are guided by his devotedness to something. The generalization is rather one that is ontological and a priori. What it has in view is not a set of ontical properties which constantly keep emerging, but a state of being which is already underlying in every case, and which first makes it ontologically possible for this entity to be addressed ontically as cura. The essential condition for the possibility of the cares of life and devotedness must be conceived as care in a sense which is primordial, that is, ontological. The transcendental generality of the phenomenon of care and of all fundamental existentialia, things which are existential, is on the other hand broad enough to present a basis on which every interpretation of Dasein, which is ontical, and belongs to a world-view, must move, whether Dasein is understood as affliction, naught, and the cares of life, or in an opposite manner. The very emptiness and generality which obtrude themselves ontically in existential structures have an ontological definiteness and fullness of their own. Thus Dasein's whole constitution itself is not simple in its unity, but shows a structural articulation. In the existential conception of care, this articulation becomes expressed. Thus, by our ontological interpretation of Dasein, we have been brought to the existential conception of care from Dasein's pre-ontological interpretation of itself as care. Yet the analytic of Dasein is not aimed at laying an ontological basis for anthropology. Its purpose is one of fundamental ontology. This is the purpose that has tacitly determined the course of our considerations hitherto, our selection of phenomena, and the limits to which our analysis may proceed. Now, however, with regard to our leading question of the meaning of being and our way of working this out, our investigation must give us explicit assurance as to what we have so far achieved. But this sort of thing is not to be reached by superficially taking together what we have discussed. Rather, with the help of what we have achieved, that which could be indicated only crudely at the beginning of the existential analytic must now be concentrated into a more penetrating understanding of the problem. Section 43. Dasein, Worldhood, and Reality. The question of the meaning of being becomes possible at all only if there is something like an understanding of being. Understanding of being belongs to the kind of being which the entity called Dasein possesses. The more appropriately and primordially we have succeeded in explicating this entity, the surer we are to attain our goal in the further course of working out the problem of fundamental ontology. In our pursuit of the tasks of a preparatory existential analytic of Dasein, there emerged an interpretation of understanding, meaning, and interpretation. Our analysis of Dasein's disclosedness showed further that with this disclosedness, Dasein, in its basic state of being in the world, has been revealed equiprimordially with regard to the world, being in and the self. Furthermore, in the factical disclosedness of the world, entities within the world are discovered too. This implies that the being of these entities is always understood in a certain manner, even if it is not conceived in a way which is appropriately ontological. To be sure, the pre-ontological understanding of being embraces all entities which are essentially disclosed in Dasein, but the understanding of being has not yet articulated itself in a way which corresponds to the various modes of being. At the same time, our interpretation of understanding has shown that, in accordance with its falling kind of being, it has proximally and for the most part diverted itself, sich verlegt, into an understanding of the world. Even where the issue is not only one of ontical experience, but also one of ontological understanding, the interpretation of being takes its orientation in the first instance from the being of entities within the world. Thereby, the being of what is proximally ready to hand gets passed over, and entities are first conceived as a context of things, res, which are present at hand. Being acquires the meaning of reality. Substantiality becomes the basic characteristic of being. Corresponding to this way in which the understanding of being has been diverted, even the ontological understanding of Dasein moves into the horizon of this conception of being. Like any other entity, Dasein, too, is present at hand as real. In this way, being in general acquires the meaning of reality. Accordingly, the concept of reality has a peculiar priority in the ontological problematic. By this priority, the route to a genuine existential analytic of Dasein gets diverted, and so too does our very view of the being of what is proximally ready to hand within the world. It finally forces the general problematic of being into a direction that lies off the course. The other modes of being become defined negatively and privatively with regard to reality. Thus, not only the analytic of Dasein, but the working out of the question of the meaning of being in general must be turned away from a one-sided orientation with regard to being in the sense of reality. We must demonstrate that reality is not only one kind of being among others, but that, ontologically, it has a definite connection in its foundations with Dasein, the world, and readiness to hand. To demonstrate this, we must discuss in principle the problem of reality, its conditions, and its limits. Under the heading Problem of Reality, various questions are clustered. 1. Whether any entities which supposedly transcend our consciousness are at all. 2. Whether this reality of the external world can be adequately proved. 3. How far this entity, if it is real, is to be known in its being in itself. 4. What the meaning of this entity, reality, signifies in general. The following discussion of the problem of reality will treat 3 topics with regard to the question of fundamental ontology. A. Reality as a problem of being, and whether the external world can be proved. B. Reality as an ontological problem. C. Reality and care. A. Reality as a problem of being and whether the external world can be proved. Of these questions about reality, the one which comes first in order is the ontological question of what reality signifies in general. But as long as a pure ontological problematic and methodology was lacking, this question, if it was explicitly formulated at all, was necessarily confounded with a discussion of the problem of the external world, for the analysis of reality is possible only on the basis of our having appropriate access to the real. But it has long been held that the way to grasp the real is by that kind of knowing which is characterized by beholding, das anschauende Erkennen. Such knowing is as a way in which the soul, or consciousness, behaves. Insofar as reality has the character of something independent and in itself, the question of the meaning of reality becomes linked with that of whether the real can be independent of consciousness, or whether there can be a transcendence of consciousness into the sphere of the real. The possibility of an adequate ontological analysis of reality depends upon how far that of which the real is to be thus independent, how far that which is to be transcended has itself been clarified with regard to its being. Only thus can even the kind of being which belongs to transcendence be ontologically grasped. And finally, we must make sure what kind of primary access we have to the real, by deciding the question of whether knowing can take over this function at all. These investigations, which take precedence over any possible ontological question about reality, have been carried out in the foregoing existential analytic. According to this analytic, knowing is a founded mode of access to the real. The real is essentially accessible only as entities within the world. All access to such entities is founded ontologically upon the basic state of Dasein, being in the world, and this in turn has care as its even more primordial state of being, ahead of itself, being already in a world, as being alongside entities within the world. The question of whether there is a world at all, and whether its being can be proved, makes no sense if it is raised by Dasein as being in the world. And who else would raise it? Furthermore, it is encumbered with a double signification. The world as the wherein, thus worin, of being in, and the world as entities within the world, that in which, thus wobei, one is concernfully absorbed, either have been confused or are not distinguished at all. But the world is disclosed essentially along with the being of Dasein. With the disclosedness of the world has in each case been discovered too. Of course, entities within the world, in the sense of the real as merely present at hand, are the very things that can remain concealed. But even the real can be discovered only on the basis of a world which has already been disclosed. And only on this basis can anything real still remain hidden. The question of the reality of the external world gets raised without any previous clarification of the phenomenon of the world as such. Factically, the problem of the external world is constantly oriented with regard to entities within the world, things and objects. So these discussions drift along into a problematic which it is almost impossible to disentangle ontologically. Kant's refutation of idealism shows how intricate these questions are, and how what one wants to prove gets muddled with what one does prove, and with the means whereby the proof is carried out. Kant calls it a scandal of philosophy and of human reason in general that there is still no cogent proof for the Dasein of things outside of us, which will do away with any skepticism. He proposes such a proof himself, and indeed he does so to provide grounds for his theorem that the mere consciousness of my own Dasein, a consciousness which, however, is empirical in character, proves the Dasein of objects in the space outside of me. We must in the first instance note explicitly that Kant uses the term Dasein to designate that kind of being which in the present investigation we have called presence at hand. Consciousness of my Dasein means for Kant a consciousness of my being present at hand, in the sense of Descartes. When Kant uses the term Dasein, he has in mind the being present at hand of consciousness just as much as the being present at hand of things. The proof for the Dasein of things outside of me is supported by the fact that both change and performance belong with equal primordiality to the essence of time. My own being present at hand, that is, the being present at hand of a multiplicity of representations, which has been given in the inner sense, is a process of change which is present at hand. To have a determinate temporal character, Zeitbestimmtheit, however, presupposes something present at hand which is permanent. But this cannot be in us, for only through what is thus permanent can my Dasein in time be determined. Thus, if changes which are present at hand have been posited empirically in me, it is necessary that, along with these, something permanent which is present at hand should be posited empirically outside of me. What is thus permanent is the condition which makes it possible for the changes in me to be present at hand. The experience of the being in time of representations posits something changing in me and something permanent outside of me, and it posits both with equal primordiality. Of course, this proof is not a causal inference and is therefore not encumbered with the disadvantages which that would imply. Kant gives, as it were, an ontological proof in terms of the idea of a temporal entity. It seems at first as if Kant has given up the Cartesian approach of positing a subject one can come across in isolation, but only in semblance. That Kant demands any proof at all for the Dasein of things outside of me shows already that he takes the subject, the in me, as the starting point for this problematic. Moreover, his proof itself is then carried through by starting with the empirically given changes in me. For only in me is time experienced, and time carries the burden of the proof. Time provides the basis for leaping off into what is outside of me in the course of the proof. Furthermore, Kant emphasizes that the problematical kind of idealism, which merely alleges our inability to prove by immediate experience that there is a Dasein outside of our own, is reasonable and accords with a sound kind of philosophical thinking, namely to permit no decisive judgment until an adequate proof has been found. But even if the ontological priority of the isolated subject and inner experience should be given up, Descartes' position would still be retained ontologically. What Kant proves, if we may suppose that his proof is correct and correctly based, is that entities which are changing and entities which are permanent are necessarily present at hand together. But when two things which are present at hand are thus put on the same level, this does not as yet mean that subject and object are present at hand together. And even if this were proved, what is ontologically decisive would still be covered up, namely the basic state of the subject, Dasein, as being in the world. The being present at hand together of the physical and the psychical is completely different ontically and ontologically from the phenomenon of being in the world. Kant presupposes both the distinction between the in me and the outside of me, and also the connection between these. Factically, he is correct in doing so, but he is incorrect from the standpoint of the tendency of his proof. It has not been demonstrated that the sort of thing which gets established about the being present at hand together of the changing and the permanent when one takes time as one's clue will also apply to the connection between the in me and the outside of me. But if one were to see the whole distinction between the inside and the outside and the whole connection between them which Kant's proof presupposes, and if one were to have an ontological conception of what has been presupposed in this presupposition, then the possibility of holding that a proof of the Dasein of things outside of me is a necessary one, which has yet to be given, noch ausstehend, would collapse. The scandal of philosophy is not that this proof has yet to be given, but that such proofs are expected and attempted again and again. Such expectations, aims, and demands arise from an ontologically inadequate way of starting with something of such a character that independently of it and outside of it a world is to be proved as present at hand. It is not that the proofs are inadequate, but that the kind of being of the entity which does the proving and makes requests for proofs has not been made definite enough. This is why a demonstration that two things which are present at hand are necessarily present at hand together can give rise to the illusion that something has been proved, or even can be proved, about Dasein as being in the world. If Dasein is understood correctly, it defies such proofs, because, in its being, it already is what subsequent proofs deem necessary to demonstrate for it. If one were to conclude that since the being present at hand of things outside of us is impossible to prove, it must therefore be merely taken on faith, one would still fail to surmount this perversion of the problem. The assumption would remain that at bottom and ideally it must still be possible to carry out such a proof. This inappropriate way of approaching the problem is still endorsed when one restricts oneself to a faith in the reality of the external world, even if such a faith is explicitly acknowledged as such. Although one is not offering a stringent proof, one is still in principle demanding a proof and trying to satisfy that demand. Even if one should invoke the doctrine that the subject must presuppose, and indeed always does, unconsciously presuppose the presence at hand of the external world, one would still be starting with the construct of an isolated subject. The phenomenon of being in the world is something that one would no more meet in this way than one would by demonstrating that the physical and the psychical are present at hand together. With such presuppositions, Dasein always comes too late, for insofar as it does this presupposing as an entity, and otherwise this would be impossible, it is, as an entity, already in a world. Earlier than any presupposition which Dasein makes, or any of its ways of behaving, is the a priori character of its state of being, as one whose kind of being is care. To have faith in the reality of the external world, whether rightly or wrongly, To prove this reality for it, whether adequately or inadequately, to presuppose it, whether explicitly or not, attempts such as these, which have not mastered their own basis with full transparency, presuppose a subject which is proximally worldless or unsure of its world, and which must at bottom first assure itself of a world. Thus, from the very beginning, being in a world is disposed to take things in some way, auffassen, to suppose, to be certain, to have faith, a way of behaving which itself is always a founded mode of being in the world. The problem of reality in the sense of the question whether an external world is present at hand, and whether such a world can be proved, turns out to be an impossible one, not because its consequences lead to inextricable impasses, but because the very entity which serves as its theme is one which, as it were, repudiates any such formulation of the question. Our task is not to prove that an external world is present at hand, or to show how it is present at hand, but to point out why Dasein, as being in the world, has the tendency to bury the external world in nullity epistemologically before going on to prove it. The reason for this lies in Dasein's falling, and in the way in which the primary understanding of being has been diverted to being as presence at hand, a diversion which is motivated by that falling itself. If one formulates the question critically with such an ontological orientation, then what one finds present at hand as proximally and solely certain is something merely inner. After the primordial phenomenon of being in the world has been shattered, the isolated subject is all that remains, and this becomes the basis on which it gets joined together with a world. In this investigation we cannot discuss at length the many attempts to solve the problem of reality, which have been developed in various kinds of realism and idealism, and in positions which mediate between them. Certainly a grain of genuine inquiry is to be found in each of these, but certain as this is, it would be just as perverse if one should want to achieve a tenable solution of the problem by reckoning up how much has been correct in each case. What is needed, rather, is the basic insight that, while the different epistemological directions which have been pursued have not gone so very far off epistemologically, their neglect of any existential analytic of Dasein has kept them from obtaining any basis for a well-secured phenomenal problematic. Nor is such a basis to be obtained by subsequently making phenomenological corrections on the concepts of subject and consciousness. Such a procedure would give no guarantee that the inappropriate formulation of the question would not continue to stand. Along with Dasein as being in the world, entities within the world have in each case already been disclosed. This existential ontological assertion seems to accord with the thesis of realism that the external world is really present at hand. Insofar as this existential assertion does not deny that entities within the world are present at hand, it agrees, doxographically as it were, with the thesis of realism in its results. But it differs in principle from every kind of realism, for realism holds that the reality of the world not only needs to be proved, but also is capable of proof. In the existential assertion, both of these positions are directly negated. But what distinguishes this assertion from realism altogether is the fact that in realism there is a lack of ontological understanding. Indeed, realism tries to explain reality ontically by real connections of interaction between things that are real. As compared with realism, idealism, no matter how contrary and untenable it may be in its results, has an advantage in principle, provided that it does not misunderstand itself as psychological idealism. If idealism emphasizes that being and reality are only in the consciousness, this expresses an understanding of the fact that being cannot be explained through entities. But as long as idealism fails to clarify what this very understanding of being means ontologically, or how this understanding is possible, or that it belongs to Dasein's state of being, the interpretation of reality which idealism constructs is an empty one. Yet the fact that being cannot be explained through entities and that reality is possible only in the understanding of being does not absolve us from inquiring into the being of consciousness, of the res cogitans, thinking thing itself. If the idealist thesis is to be followed consistently, the ontological analysis of consciousness itself is prescribed as an inevitable prior task. Only because being is in the consciousness, that is to say, only because it is understandable in Dasein, can Dasein also understand and conceptualize such characteristics of being as independence, the in-itself, and reality in general. Only because of this are independent entities, as encountered within the world, accessible to circumspection. If what the term idealism says amounts to the understanding that being can never be explained by entities, but is already that which is transcendental for every entity, then idealism affords the only correct possibility for a philosophical problematic. If so, Aristotle was no less an idealist than Kant. But if idealism signifies tracing back every entity to a subject or consciousness, whose sole distinguishing features are that it remains indefinite in its being, and is best characterized negatively as unthing-like, then this idealism is no less naive in its method than the most grossly militant realism. It is still possible that one may give the problematic of reality priority over any orientation in terms of standpoints, by maintaining the thesis that every subject is what it is only for an object, and vice versa. But in this formal approach, the terms thus correlated, like the correlation itself, remain ontologically indefinite. At the bottom, however, the whole correlation necessarily gets thought of as somehow being, and must therefore be thought of with regard to some definite idea of being. Of course, if the existential ontological basis has been made secure beforehand, by exhibiting being in the world, then this correlation is one that we can know later as a formalized relation, ontologically undifferentiated. Our discussion of the unexpressed presuppositions of attempts to solve the problem of reality in ways which are just epistemological shows that this problem must be taken back, as an ontological one, into the existential analytic of Dasein. B. Reality as an ontological problem. If the term reality is meant to stand for the being of entities present at hand within the world, res, and nothing else is understood thereby, then when it comes to analyzing this mode of being, this signifies that entities within the world are ontologically conceivable only if the phenomenon of within-the-worldness has been clarified. But within-the-worldness is based upon the phenomenon of the world, which, for its part, as an essential item in the structure of being in the world, belongs to the basic constitution of Dasein. Being in the world, in turn, is bound up ontologically in the structural totality of Dasein's being, and we have characterized care as such a totality. But in this way we have marked out the foundations and the horizons which must be clarified if an analysis of reality is to be possible. Only in this connection, moreover, does the character of the in-itself become ontologically intelligible. By taking our orientation from this context of problems, we have in our earlier analyses interpreted the being of entities within the world. To be sure, the reality of the real can be characterized phenomenologically within certain limits without any explicit existential ontological basis. This is what Dilthey has attempted in the article mentioned above. He holds that the real gets experienced in impulse and will, and that reality is resistance, or more exactly the character of resisting. He then works out the phenomenon of resistance analytically. This is the positive contribution of his article, and provides the best concrete substantiation for his idea of a psychology which both describes and dissects. But he is kept from working out the analysis of this phenomenon correctly by the epistemological problematic of reality. The principle of phenomenality does not enable him to come to an ontological interpretation of the being of consciousness. Within the same consciousness, he writes, the will and its inhibition emerge. What kind of being belongs to this emerging? What is the meaning of the being of the within? What relationship of being does consciousness bear to the real itself? All this must be determined ontologically. That this has not been done depends ultimately on the fact that Dilthey has left life standing in such a manner that it is ontologically undifferentiated, And of course, life is something which one cannot go back behind. But to interpret Dasein ontologically does not signify that we must go back ontically to some other entity. The fact that Dilthey has been refuted epistemologically cannot prevent us from making fruitful use of what is positive in his analyses, the very thing that has not been understood in such refutations. Thus, Scheler has recently taken up Dilthey's interpretation of reality. He stands for a voluntative theory of Dasein. Here, Dasein is understood in the Kantian sense as being present at hand. The being of objects is given immediately only in the way it is related to drive and will. Scheler not only emphasizes, as does Dilthey, that reality is never primarily given in thinking and apprehending. He also points out particularly that cognition, erkennen, itself is not judgment, and that knowing, wissen, is a relationship of being. What we have already said about the ontological indefiniteness of Dilthey's foundations holds in principle for this theory too. Nor can the fundamental ontological analysis of life be slipped in afterwards as a substructure. Such a fundamental analysis provides the supporting conditions for the analysis of reality, for the entire explication of the character of resisting and its phenomenal presuppositions. Resistance is encountered in a not coming through, and it is encountered as a hindrance to willing to come through. With such willing, however, something must already have been disclosed which one's drive and one's will are out for. But what they are out for is ontically indefinite, and this indefiniteness must not be overlooked ontologically, or taken as if it were nothing. When being out for something comes up against resistance, and can do nothing but come up against it, it is itself already alongside a totality of involvements. But the fact that this totality has been discovered is grounded in the disclosedness of the referential totality of significance. The experiencing of resistance, that is, the discovery of what is resistant to one's endeavours, is possible ontologically only by reason of the disclosedness of the world. The character of resisting is one that belongs to entities within the world. Factically, experiences of resistance determine only the extent and the direction in which entities encountered within the world are discovered. The summation of such experiences does not introduce the disclosure of the world for the first time, but presupposes it. The against and the counter to, as ontological possibilities, are supported by disclosed being in the world. Nor is resistance experienced in a drive or will which emerges in its own right. These both turn out to be modifications of care. Only entities with this kind of being can come up against something resistant as something within the world. So if reality gets defined as the character of resisting, we must notice two things. First, that this is only one character of reality among others. Second, that the character of resisting presupposes necessarily a world which has already been disclosed. Resistance characterizes the external world in the sense of entities within the world, but never in the sense of the world itself. Consciousness of reality is itself a way of being in the world. Every problematic of the external world comes back necessarily to this basic existential phenomenon. If the cogito sum, I think, I am, is to serve as the point of departure for the existential analytic of Dasein, then it needs to be turned around, and furthermore its content needs new ontologico-phenomenal confirmation. The sum is then asserted first, and indeed in the sense that I am in a world. As such an entity, I am in the possibility of being towards various ways of comporting myself, namely cogitationes, thinkings, as ways of being alongside entities within the world. Descartes, on the contrary, says that cogitationes are present at hand, and that in these an ego is present at hand too as a worldless res cogitans. C. Reality and care. Reality as an ontological term is one which we have related to entities within the world. If it serves to designate this kind of being in general, then readiness to hand and presence at hand function as modes of reality. If, however, one lets this world have its traditional signification, then it stands for being in the sense of the pure presence at hand of things. But not all presence at hand is the presence at hand of things. The nature by which we are surrounded is, of course, an entity within the world, but the kind of being which it shows belongs neither to the ready-to-hand nor to what is present at hand as things of nature. No matter how this being of nature may be interpreted, all the modes of being of entities within the world are founded ontologically upon the worldhood of the world, and accordingly upon the phenomenon of being in the world. From this there arises the insight that among the modes of being of entities within the world, reality has no priority, and that reality is a kind of being which cannot even characterize anything like the world, or Dasein in a way which is ontologically appropriate. In the order of the ways in which things are connected in their ontological foundations, and in the order of any possible categorial and existential demonstration, reality is referred back to the phenomenon of care. But the fact that reality is ontologically grounded in the being of Dasein does not signify that only when Dasein exists, and as long as Dasein exists, can the real be as that which in itself it is. Of course, only as long as Dasein is, that is, only as long as an understanding of being is ontically possible, is there being. When Dasein does not exist, independence is not either, nor is the in itself. In such a case, this sort of thing can neither be understood nor not understood. In such a case, even entities within the world can neither be discovered nor lie hidden. In such a case, it cannot be said that entities are, nor can it be said that they are not. But now, as long as there is an understanding of being, and therefore an understanding of presence at hand, it can indeed be said that in this case entities will still continue to be. As we have noted, being, not entities, is dependent upon the understanding of being. That is to say, reality, not the real, is dependent upon care. By this dependency our further analytic of Dasein is held secure in the face of an uncritical interpretation, which nevertheless keeps urging itself upon us, an interpretation in which the idea of reality is taken as the clue to Dasein. Only if we take our orientation from existentiality as interpreted in an ontologically positive manner, can we have any guarantee that in the factical course of the analysis of consciousness, or of life, some sense of reality does not get made basic, even if it is one which has not been further differentiated. Entities with Dasein's kind of being cannot be conceived in terms of reality and substantiality. We have expressed this by the thesis that the substance of man is existence. Yet, if we have interpreted existentiality as care, and distinguished this from reality, this does not signify that our existential analytic is at an end. We have merely allowed the intricate problems of the question of being and its possible modes, and the question of the meaning of such modifications, to emerge more sharply. Only if the understanding of being is, do entities as entities become accessible. Only if entities are of Dasein's kind of being is the understanding of being possible as an entity. 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 Section 44. Dasein, Disclosedness, and Truth. From time immemorial, philosophy has associated truth and being. Parmenides was the first to discover the being of entities, and he identified being with the perceptive understanding of being. Toga auto noen estin te kai enai. For thought and being are the same thing. Aristotle, in outlining the history of how the archai, origins, have been uncovered, emphasizes that the philosophers before him, under the guidance of the things themselves, have been compelled to inquire further. Hauto to pragma, hoto poiesen autois, kai sunenankase zetein. The very fact showed them the way and joined in forcing them to investigate the subject, he is describing the same fact when he says, "Anan katsomenos de akoluthein tois phaenomenois." He, Parmenides, was compelled to follow that which showed itself in itself. In another passage he remarks that these thinkers carried on their researches, compelled by the truth itself. Aristotle describes these researches as philosophizing about the truth, or even as exhibiting something and letting it be seen with regard to the truth, and within the range of the truth. Philosophy itself is defined as the science of the truth. But it is also characterized as a science which contemplates entities as entities, that is, with regard to their being. What is signified here by carrying on researches into the truth, by science of the truth? In such researches, is truth made a theme, as it would be in a theory of knowledge or of judgment? Manifestly not, for truth signifies the same as thing, Sache, something that shows itself. But what, then, does the expression truth signify if it can be used as a term for entity and being? If, however, truth rightfully has a primordial connection with being, then the phenomenon of truth comes within the range of the problematic of fundamental ontology. In that case, must not this phenomenon have been encountered already within our preparatory fundamental analysis, the analytic of Dasein? What ontico-ontological connection does truth have with Dasein and with that ontical characteristic of Dasein, which we call the understanding of being? Can the reason why being necessarily goes together with truth, and vice versa, be pointed out in terms of such understanding? These questions are not to be evaded, because being does indeed go together with truth. The phenomenon of truth has already been one of the themes of our earlier analyses, though not explicitly under this title. In giving precision to the problem of being, it is now time to delimit the phenomenon of truth explicitly, and to fix the problems which it comprises. In doing this, we should not just take together what we have previously taken apart. Our investigation requires a new approach. Our analysis takes its departure from the traditional conception of truth, and attempts to lay bare the ontological foundations of that conception. In terms of these foundations, the primordial phenomenon of truth becomes visible. We can then exhibit the way in which the traditional conception of truth has been derived from this phenomenon. B, our investigation will make it plain that to the question of the essence of truth, there belongs necessarily the question of the kind of being which truth possesses. Together with this, we must clarify the ontological meaning of the kind of talk in which we say that there is truth. And we must also clarify the kind of necessity with which we must presuppose that there is truth. A, the traditional conception of truth and its ontological foundations. There are three theses which characterize the way in which the essence of truth has been traditionally taken, and the way it is supposed to have been first defined. 1, that the locus of truth is assertion, judgment. 2, that the essence of truth lies in the agreement of the judgment with its object. 3, that Aristotle, the father of logic, not only has assigned truth to the judgment as its primordial locus, but has set going the definition of truth as agreement. Here it is not our aim to provide a history of the concept of truth, which could be presented only on the basis of a history of ontology. We shall introduce our analytical discussions by alluding to some familiar matters. Aristotle says that the soul's experiences, its representations, are likenings of things. This assertion, which is by no means proposed as an explicit definition of the essence of truth, has also given occasion for developing the later formulation of the essence of truth as adequatio intellectus et rei, likeness of intellect and thing. Thomas Aquinas, who refers this definition to Avicenna, who in turn has taken it over from Isaac Israeli's 10th century Book of Definitions, also uses for adequatio likening the terms correspondentia, correspondence, and convenientia, coming together. The neo-Kantian epistemology of the 19th century often characterized this definition of truth as an expression of a methodologically retarded, naive realism, and declared it to be irreconcilable with any formulation of this question which has undergone Kant's Copernican revolution. But Kant, too, adhered to this conception of truth, so much so that he did not even bring it up for discussion. This has been overlooked, though Brentano has already called our attention to it. The old and celebrated question with which it was supposed that one might drive the logicians into a corner is this: what is truth? The explanation of the name of truth, namely that it is the agreement of knowledge with its object, will here be granted and presupposed. If truth consists in the agreement of knowledge with its object, then this object must thus be distinguished from others, for knowledge is false if it does not agree with the object to which it is related, even if it should contain something which might well be valid for other objects. And in the introduction to the Transcendental Dialectic, Kant states, "Truth and illusion are not in the object so far as it is intuited, but in the judgment about it so far as it is thought." Of course, this characterization of truth as agreement, adequatio, likeness, is very general and empty. Yet it will still have some justification if it can hold its own without prejudice to any of the most various interpretations which that distinctive predicate, knowledge, will support. We are now inquiring into the foundations of this relation. What else is tacitly posited in this relational totality of the adequatio intellectus et re, likeness of intellect and thing, and what ontological character does that which is thus posited have itself? What in general does one have in view when one uses the term agreement? The agreement of something with something has the formal character of a relation of something to something. Every agreement, and therefore truth as well, is a relation. But not every relation is an agreement. A sign points at what is indicated. Such indicating is a relation, but not an agreement of the sign with what is indicated. Yet manifestly not every agreement is a convenientia of the kind that is fixed upon in the definition of truth. The number 6 agrees with 16 minus 10. These numbers agree. They are equal with regard to the question of how much. Equality is one way of agreeing. Its structure is such that something like a with regard to belongs to it. In the adequatio, something gets related. What is that with regard to which it agrees? In clarifying the truth relation, we must notice also what is peculiar to the terms of this relation. With regard to what do intellectus and res, intellect and thing, agree? In their kind of being and their essential content, do they give us anything at all with regard to which they can agree? If it is impossible for intellectus and res to be equal because they are not of the same species, are they then perhaps similar? But knowledge is still supposed to give the thing just as it is. This agreement has the relational character of the just as, so wie. In what way is this relation possible as a relation between intellectus and res? From these questions it becomes plain that to clarify the structure of truth, it is not enough simply to presuppose this relational totality, but we must go back and inquire into the context of being, which provides the support for this totality as such. Must we, however, bring up here the epistemological problematic as regards the subject-object relation, or can our analysis restrict itself to interpreting the immanent consciousness of truth, and thus remain within the sphere of the subject? According to the general opinion, what is true is knowledge, but knowledge is judging. In judgment, one must distinguish between the judging as a real psychical process and that which is judged as an ideal content. It will be said of the latter that it is true. The real psychical process, however, is either present at hand or not. According to this opinion, the ideal content of judgment stands in a relationship of agreement. This relationship thus pertains to a connection between an ideal content of judgment and the real thing, as that which is judged about. Is this agreement real or ideal in its kind of being? or neither of these? How are we to take ontologically the relation between an ideal entity and something that is real and present at hand? Such a relation indeed subsists, besteht. And in factical judgments, it subsists not only as a relation between the content of judgment and the real object, but likewise as the relation between the ideal content and the real act of judgment. And does it manifestly subsist more inwardly in this latter case? Or is the ontological meaning of the relation between real and ideal methexis, participation, something about which we must not inquire? Yet the relation is to be one which subsists. What does such subsisting, Bestand, mean ontologically? Why should this not be a legitimate question? Is it accidental that no headway has been made with this problem in over 2,000 years? Has the question already been perverted in the very way it has been approached, in the ontologically unclarified separation of the real and the ideal? And with regard to the actual judging of what is judged, is the separation of the real act of judgment from the ideal content altogether unjustified? Does not the actuality of knowing and judging get broken asunder into two ways of being, two levels which can never be pieced together, in such a manner as to reach the kind of being that belongs to knowing? Is not psychologism correct in holding out against this separation, even if it neither clarifies ontologically the kind of being which belongs to the thinking of that which is thought, nor is even so much as acquainted with it as a problem? If we go back to the distinction between the act of judgment and its content, we shall not advance our discussion of the question of the kind of being which belongs to the adequatio. We shall only make plain the indispensability of clarifying the kind of being which belongs to knowledge itself. In the analysis which this necessitates, we must at the same time try to bring into view a phenomenon which is characteristic of knowledge, the phenomenon of truth. When does truth become phenomenally explicit in knowledge itself? It does so when such knowing demonstrates itself as true. By demonstrating itself, it is assured of its truth. Thus, in the phenomenal context of demonstration, the relationship of agreement must become visible. Let us suppose that someone with his back turned to the wall makes the true assertion that the picture on the wall is hanging askew. This assertion demonstrates itself when the man who makes it turns around and perceives the picture hanging askew on the wall. What gets demonstrated in this demonstration? What is the meaning of confirming, Bewährung, such an assertion? Do we, let us say, ascertain some agreement between our knowledge, or what is known, and the thing on the wall? Yes and no, depending on whether our interpretation of the expression what is known is phenomenally appropriate. If he who makes the assertion judges without perceiving the picture, but merely represents it to himself, to what is he related? To representations, shall we say? Certainly not, if representation is here supposed to signify representing as a psychical process. Nor is he related to representations in the sense of what is thus represented if, what we have in mind here, is a picture of that real thing which is on the wall. The asserting which merely represents is related rather in that sense which is most its own to the real picture on the wall. What one has in mind is the real picture, and nothing else. Any interpretation in which something else is here slipped in as what one supposedly has in mind in an assertion that merely represents, belies the phenomenal facts of the case as to that about which the assertion gets made. Asserting is a way of being towards the thing itself that is. And what does one's perceiving of it demonstrate? Nothing else than that this thing is the very entity which one has in mind in one's assertion. What comes up for confirmation is that this entity is pointed out by the being in which the assertion is made, which is being towards what is put forward in the assertion. Thus, what is to be confirmed is that such being uncovers the entity towards which it is. What gets demonstrated is the being uncovering of the assertion. In carrying out such a demonstration, the knowing remains related solely to the entity itself. In this entity, the confirmation, as it were, gets enacted. The entity itself, which one has in mind, shows itself just as it is in itself. That is to say, it shows that it, in its self-sameness, is just as it gets pointed out in the assertion as being, just as it gets uncovered as being. Representations do not get compared, either among themselves or in relation to the real thing. What is to be demonstrated is not an agreement of knowing with its object, still less of the psychical with the physical, but neither is it an agreement between contents of consciousness among themselves. What is to be demonstrated is solely the being uncovered, entdeckt sein, of the entity itself, that entity and the how of its uncoveredness. This uncoveredness is confirmed when that which is put forward in the assertion, namely the entity itself, shows itself as that very same thing. Confirmation signifies the entity's showing itself in its self-sameness. The confirmation is accomplished on the basis of the entity's showing itself. This is possible only in such a way that the knowing, which asserts and which gets confirmed, is, in its ontological meaning, itself a being towards real entities, and a being that uncovers. To say that an assertion is true signifies that it uncovers the entity as it is in itself. Such an assertion points out, lets the entity be seen in its uncoveredness. The being true, truth of the assertion must be understood as being uncovering. Thus truth has by no means the structure of an agreement between knowing and the object, in the sense of a likening of one entity, the subject, to another, the object. Being true as being uncovering is in turn ontologically possible only on the basis of being in the world. This latter phenomenon, which we have known as a basic state of Dasein, is the foundation for the primordial phenomenon of truth. We shall now follow this up more penetratingly. B. The primordial phenomenon of truth and the derivative character of the traditional conception of truth. Being true, truth means being uncovering. But is not this a highly arbitrary way to define truth? By such drastic ways of defining this concept, we may succeed in eliminating the idea of agreement from the conception of truth. Must we not pay for this dubious gain by plunging the good old tradition into nullity? But while our definition is seemingly arbitrary, it contains only the necessary interpretation of what was primordially surmised in the oldest tradition of ancient philosophy and even understood in a pre-phenomenological manner. If a logos as apophansis, discourse as making clear, is to be true, being true is alethoein, speaking the truth in the manner of apophanesthai, of taking entities out of their hiddenness and letting them be seen in their unhiddenness, their uncoveredness. The aletheia, truth, which Aristotle equates with pragma, and phenomena, thing and phenomena, in the passages cited above, signifies the things themselves. It signifies what shows itself, entities in the how of their uncoveredness. And is it accidental that in one of the fragments of Heraclitus, the oldest fragments of philosophical doctrine in which the logos is explicitly handled, the phenomenon of truth in the sense of uncoveredness, unhiddenness, as we have set it forth, shows through? Those who are lacking in understanding are contrasted with the logos, and also with him who speaks that logos and understands it. The logos is phrazon hopos echei, telling how it is. It tells how entities comport themselves. But to those who are lacking in understanding, what they do remains hidden. They forget it. That is, for them it sinks back into hiddenness. Thus to the logos belongs unhiddenness. To translate this word as truth, and above all to define this expression conceptually in theoretical ways, is to cover up the meaning of what the Greeks made self-evidently basic for the terminological use of aletheia, truth as a pre-philosophical way of understanding it. In citing such evidence, we must avoid uninhibited word mysticism. Nevertheless, the ultimate business of philosophy is to preserve the force of the most elemental words in which Dasein expresses itself, and to keep the common understanding from levelling them off to that unintelligibility which functions in turn as a source of pseudo-problems. We have now given a phenomenal demonstration of what we set forth earlier as to logos and aletheia, truth, in, so to speak, a dogmatic interpretation. In proposing our definition of truth, we have not shaken off the tradition, but we have appropriated it primordially. And we shall have done so all the more if we succeed in demonstrating that the idea of agreement is one to which theory had to come, on the basis of the primordial phenomenon of truth, and if we can show how this came about. Moreover, the definition of truth as uncoveredness and as being uncovering is not a mere explanation of a word. Among those ways in which Dasein comports itself, there are some which we are accustomed in the first instance to call true. From the analysis of these, our definition emerges. Being true as being uncovering is a way of being for Dasein. What makes this very uncovering possible must necessarily be called true in a still more primordial sense. The most primordial phenomenon of truth is first shown by the existential ontological foundations of uncovering. Uncovering is a way of being for being in the world. Circumspective concern, or even that concern in which we tarry and look at something, uncovers entities within the world. These entities become that which has been uncovered. They are true in a second sense. What is primarily true, that is, uncovering, is Dasein. Truth, in the second sense, does not mean being uncovering, but being uncovered, uncoveredness. Our earlier analysis of the worldhood of the world and of entities within the world has shown, however, that the uncoveredness of entities within the world is grounded in the world's disclosedness. But disclosedness is that basic character of Dasein, according to which it's there. Disclosedness is constituted by state of mind, understanding, and discourse, and pertains equiprimordially to the world, to being in and to the self. In its very structure, care is ahead of itself, being already in a world, as being alongside entities within the world. And in this structure the disclosedness of Dasein lies hidden, with and through its uncoveredness. Hence only with Dasein's disclosedness is the most primordial phenomenon of truth attained. What we have pointed out earlier with regard to the existential constitution of the there, and in relation to the everyday being of the there, pertains to the most primordial phenomenon of truth, nothing less. Insofar as Dasein is its disclosedness essentially, and discloses and uncovers as something disclosed, to this extent it is essentially true. Dasein is in the truth. This assertion has meaning ontologically. It does not purport to say that ontically Dasein is introduced to all the truth, either always or just in every case, but rather that the disclosedness of its ownmost being belongs to its existential constitution. If we accept the results we have obtained earlier, the full existential meaning of the principle that Dasein is in the truth can be restored by the following considerations. 1. To Dasein's state of being, disclosedness in general essentially belongs. It embraces the whole of that structure of being which has become explicit through the phenomenon of care. To care belongs not only being in the world, but also being alongside entities within the world. The uncoveredness of such entities is equiprimordial with the being of Dasein and its disclosedness. 2. To Dasein's state of being belongs thrownness. Indeed, it is constitutive for Dasein's disclosedness. In thrownness is revealed that in each case Dasein, as my Dasein and this Dasein, is already in a definite world and alongside a definite range of definite entities within the world. Disclosedness is essentially factical. 3. To Dasein's state of being belongs projection, disclosive being towards its potentiality for being. As something that understands, Dasein can understand itself in terms of the world and others, or in terms of its ownmost potentiality for being. The possibility just mentioned means that Dasein discloses itself to itself in and as its ownmost potentiality for being. This authentic disclosedness shows the phenomenon of the most primordial truth in the mode of authenticity. The most primordial, and indeed the most authentic disclosedness in which Dasein, as a potentiality for being, can be, is the truth of existence. This becomes existentially and ontologically definite only in connection with the analysis of Dasein's authenticity. 4. To Dasein's state of being belongs falling. Proximally, and for the most part, Dasein is lost in its world. Its understanding, as a projection upon possibilities of being, has diverted itself thither. Its absorption in the they signifies that it is dominated by the way things are publicly interpreted. That which has been uncovered and disclosed stands in a mode in which it has been disguised and closed off by idle talk, curiosity, and ambiguity. Being towards entities has not been extinguished, but it has been uprooted. Entities have not been completely hidden. They are precisely the sort of thing that has been uncovered, but at the same time they have been disguised. They show themselves but in the mode of semblance. Likewise, what has formerly been uncovered sinks back again, hidden and disguised. Because Dasein is essentially falling, its state of being is such that it is in untruth. This term, like the expression falling, is here used ontologically. If we are to use it in existential analysis, we must avoid giving it any ontically negative evaluation. To be closed off and covered up belongs to Dasein's facticity. In its full existential ontological meaning, the proposition that Dasein is in the truth states equiprimordially that Dasein is in untruth. But only insofar as Dasein has been disclosed has it also been closed off, and only insofar as entities within the world have been uncovered along with Dasein have such entities, as possibly encounterable within the world, been covered up, hidden, or disguised. It is therefore essential that Dasein should explicitly appropriate what has already been uncovered, defend it against semblance and disguise, and assure itself of its uncoveredness again and again. The uncovering of anything new is never done on the basis of having something completely hidden, but takes its departure rather from uncoveredness in the mode of semblance. Entities look as if, that is, they have in a certain way been uncovered already, and yet they are still disguised. Truth, uncoveredness, is something that must always first be wrested from entities. Entities get snatched out of their hiddenness. The factical uncoveredness of anything is always, as it were, a kind of robbery. Is it accidental that when the Greeks express themselves as to the essence of truth they use a privative expression, aletheia, unhiddenness? When Dasein so expresses itself, does not a primordial understanding of its own being thus make itself known? The understanding, even if it is only pre-ontological, that being in untruth makes up an essential characteristic of being in the world. The goddess of truth who guides Parmenides puts two pathways before him, one of uncovering, one of hiding. But this signifies nothing else than that Dasein is already both in the truth and in untruth. The way of uncovering is achieved only in krinein logo, in distinguishing between these understandingly, and making one's decision for the one rather than the other. The existential, ontological condition for the fact that being in the world is characterized by truth and untruth lies in that state of Dasein's being which we have designated as thrown projection. This is something that is constitutive for the structure of care. The upshot of our existential ontological interpretation of the phenomenon of truth is, 1. that truth, in the most primordial sense, is Dasein's disclosedness, to which the uncoveredness of entities within the world belongs, and 2. that Dasein is equiprimordially both in the truth and in untruth. Within the horizon of the traditional interpretation of the phenomenon of truth, our insight into these principles will not be complete until it can be shown, 1. that truth, understood as agreement, originates from disclosedness by way of definite modification, 2. That the kind of being which belongs to disclosedness itself is such that its derivative modification first comes into view and leads the way for the theoretical explication of the structure of truth. Assertion and its structure, namely the apophantical as, are founded upon interpretation and its structure, namely the hermeneutical as, and also upon understanding, upon Dasein's disclosedness. Truth, however, is regarded as a distinctive character of assertion as so derived. Thus the roots of the truth of assertion reach back to the disclosedness of the understanding. But over and above these indications of how the truth of assertion has originated, the phenomenon of agreement must not be exhibited explicitly in its derivative character. Our being alongside entities within the world is concern, and this is being which uncovers. To Dasein's disclosedness, however, discourse belongs essentially. Dasein expresses itself, spricht sich aus. It expresses itself as a being towards entities, a being towards which uncovers, and in assertion it expresses itself as such about entities which have been uncovered. Assertion communicates entities in the how of their uncoveredness. When Dasein is aware of the communication, it brings itself in its awareness into an uncovering, being towards the entities discussed. The assertion which is expressed is about something, and, in what it is about, in ihrem Worüber, it contains the uncoveredness of these entities. This uncoveredness is preserved in what is expressed. What is expressed becomes, as it were, something ready to hand within the world, which can be taken up and spoken again. Because the uncoveredness has been preserved, that which is expressed, which thus is ready to hand, has in itself a relation to any entities about which it is an assertion. Any uncoveredness is an uncoveredness of something. Even when Dasein speaks over again what someone else has said, it comes into a being towards the very entities which have been discussed. But it has been exempted from having to uncover them again, primordially, and it holds that it has been thus exempted. Dasein need not bring itself face to face with entities themselves in an original experience, but it nevertheless remains in a being towards these entities. In a large measure, uncoveredness gets appropriated not by one's own uncovering, but rather by hearsay of something that has been said. Absorption in something that has been said belongs to the kind of being which the they possess. That which has been expressed as such takes over being towards those entities which have been uncovered in the assertion. If, however, these entities are to be appropriated explicitly with regard to their uncoveredness, this amounts to saying that the assertion is to be demonstrated as one that uncovers. But the assertion expressed is something ready to hand, and indeed in such a way that, as something by which uncoveredness is preserved, it has in itself a relation to the entities uncovered. Now, to demonstrate that it is something which uncovers, ihres Entdeckendseins, means to demonstrate how the assertion by which the uncoveredness is preserved is related to those entities. The assertion is something ready to hand. The entities to which it is related as something that uncovers are either ready to hand or present at hand within the world. The relation itself presents itself thus as one that is present at hand. But this relation lies in the fact that the uncoveredness preserved in the assertion is in each case an uncoveredness of something. The judgment contains something which holds for the objects, Kant. But the relation itself now acquires the character of presence at hand by getting switched over to a relationship between things which are present at hand. But the relation itself now acquires the character of presence at hand by getting switched over to a relationship between things which are present at hand. The uncoveredness of something becomes the present-at-hand conformity of one thing which is present at hand, the assertion expressed, to something else which is present at hand, the entity under discussion. And if this conformity is seen only as a relationship between things which are present at hand, that is, if the kind of being which belongs to the terms of this relationship has not been discriminated, and is understood as something merely present at hand, then the relation shows itself as an agreement of two things which are present at hand, an agreement which is present at hand itself. When the assertion has been expressed, the uncoveredness of the entity moves into the kind of being of that which is ready to hand within the world. But now, to the extent that in this uncoveredness, as an uncoveredness of something, a relationship to something present at hand persists, the uncoveredness, truth, becomes, for its part, a relationship between things which are present at hand, intellectus and res, a relationship that is present at hand itself. Though it is founded upon Dasein's disclosedness, the existential phenomenon of uncoveredness becomes a property which is present at hand, but in which there still lurks a relational character. And as such a property, it gets broken asunder into a relationship which is present at hand. Truth as disclosedness and as a being towards uncovered entities, a being which itself uncovers, has become truth as agreement between things which are present at hand within the world. And thus we have pointed out the ontologically derivative character of the traditional conception of truth. Yet that which is last in the order of the way things are connected in their foundations existentially and ontologically is regarded ontically and factically as that which is first and closest to us. The necessity of this fact, however, is based in turn upon the kind of being which Dasein itself possesses. Dasein, in its concernful absorption, understands itself in terms of what it encounters within the world. The uncoveredness which belongs to uncovering is something that we come across proximally within the world, in that which has been expressed, im Ausgesprochenen. Not only truth, however, is encountered as present at hand. In general, our understanding of being is such that every entity is understood, in the first instance, as present at hand. If the truth which we encounter proximally in an ontical manner is considered ontologically in the way that is closest to us, then the logos, the assertion, gets understood as logos tinos, as an assertion about something, an uncoveredness of something. But the phenomenon gets interpreted as something present at hand with regard to its possible presence at hand. Yet because presence at hand has been equated with the meaning of being in general, the question of whether this kind of being, of truth, is a primordial one, and whether there is anything primordial in that structure of it which we encounter as closest to us, cannot come alive at all. The primordial phenomenon of truth has been covered up by Dasein's very understanding of being, that understanding which is proximally the one that prevails, and which even today has not been surmounted explicitly and in principle. At the same time, however, we must not overlook the fact that while this way of understanding being, the way which is closest to us, is one which the Greeks were the first to develop as a branch of knowledge and to master, the primordial understanding of truth was simultaneously alive among them, even if pre-ontologically, and it even held its own against the concealment implicit in their ontology, at least in Aristotle. Aristotle never defends the thesis that the primordial locus of truth is in the judgment. He says rather that the logos is that way of being in which Dasein can either uncover or cover up. This double possibility is what is distinctive in the being true of the logos. The logos is that way of comporting oneself which can also cover things up. And because Aristotle never upheld the thesis we have mentioned, he was also never in a situation to broaden the conception of truth in the logos to include pure noesis. The truth of aesthesis, perception, and of the seeing of ideas is the primordial kind of uncovering, and only because noesis, thought, primarily uncovers, can the logos, as dianoein, discourse as thinking, also have uncovering as its function. Not only is it wrong to invoke Aristotle for the thesis that the genuine locus of truth lies in the judgment, even in its content this thesis fails to recognize the structure of truth. Assertion is not the primary locus of truth. On the contrary, whether as a mode in which uncoveredness is appropriated or as a way of being in the world, assertion is grounded in Dasein's uncovering, or rather in its disclosedness. The most primordial truth is the locus of assertion. It is the ontological condition for the possibility that assertions can be either true or false, that they may uncover or cover things up. Truth, understood in the most primordial sense, belongs to the basic constitution of Dasein. The term signifies an existentiale, existential thing, but herewith we have already sketched out our answers to the question of what kind of being truth possesses, and to the question of in what sense it is necessary to presuppose that there is truth. C. The kind of being which truth possesses and the presupposition of truth. Dasein, as constituted by disclosedness, is essentially in the truth. Disclosedness is a kind of being which is essential to Dasein. There is truth only in so far as Dasein is, and so long as Dasein is. Entities are uncovered only when Dasein is, and only as long as Dasein is. Are they disclosed? Newton's laws, the principle of contradiction, any truth whatever, these are true only as long as Dasein is. Before there was any Dasein, there was no truth, nor will there be any after Dasein is no more. For in such a case, truth as disclosedness, uncovering and uncoveredness, cannot be. Before Newton's laws were discovered, they were not true. It does not follow that they were false, or even that they would become false, if ontically no discoveredness were any longer possible. Just as little does this restriction imply that the being true of truths has in any way been diminished. To say that before Newton his laws were neither true nor false cannot signify that before him there were no such entities as have been uncovered and pointed out by those laws. Through Newton the laws became true, and with them entities became accessible in themselves to Dasein. Once entities have been uncovered, they show themselves precisely as entities which beforehand already were. Such uncovering is the kind of being which belongs to truth. That there are eternal truths will not be adequately proved until someone has succeeded in demonstrating that Dasein has been and will be for all eternity. As long as such a proof is still outstanding, this principle remains a fanciful contention, which does not gain in legitimacy from having philosophers commonly believe it. Because the kind of being that is essential to truth is of the character of Dasein, all truth is relative to Dasein's being. Does this relativity signify that all truth is subjective? If one interprets subjective as left to the subject's discretion, then it certainly does not. For uncovering, in the sense which is most its own, takes asserting out of the province of subjective discretion, and brings the uncovering Dasein face to face with the entities themselves. And only because truth, as uncovering, is a kind of being which belongs to Dasein, can it be taken out of the province of Dasein's discretion. Even the universal validity of truth is rooted solely in the fact that Dasein can uncover entities in themselves and free them. Only so can these entities in themselves be binding for every possible assertion, that is, for every way of pointing them out. If truth has been correctly understood, is it in the least impaired by the fact that it is ontically possible only in the subject, and that it stands and falls with the being of that subject. Now that we have an existential conception of the kind of being that belongs to truth, the meaning of presupposing the truth also becomes intelligible. Why must we presuppose that there is truth? What is presupposing? What do we have in mind with the must and the we? What does it mean to say there is truth? We presuppose truth because we, being in the kind of being which Dasein possesses, are in the truth. We do not presuppose it as something outside us and above us, towards which, along with other values, we comport ourselves. It is not we who presuppose truth, but it is truth that makes it at all possible ontologically for us to be able to be such that we presuppose anything at all. Truth is what first makes possible anything like presupposing. What does it mean to presuppose? It is to understand something as the ground for the being of some other entity. Such understanding of an entity and its interconnections of being is possible only on the ground of disclosedness, that is, on the ground of Dasein's being something which uncovers. Thus, to presuppose truth means to understand it as something for the sake of which Dasein is. But Dasein is already ahead of itself in each case. This is implied in its state of being as care. It is an entity for which, in its being, its ownmost potentiality for being is an issue. To Dasein's being and its potentiality for being as being in the world, disclosedness and uncovering belong essentially. To Dasein, its potentiality for being in the world is an issue, and this includes concerning itself with entities within the world and uncovering them circumspectively. In Dasein's state of being as care, in being ahead of itself, lies the most primordial presupposing. Because this presupposing of itself belongs to Dasein's being, we must also presuppose ourselves as having the attribute of disclosedness. There are also entities with a character other than that of Dasein, but the presupposing, which lies in Dasein's being, does not relate itself to these. It relates itself solely to Dasein itself. The truth which has been presupposed, or the there is, by which its being is to be defined, has that kind of being, or meaning of being, which belongs to Dasein itself. We must make the presupposition of truth because it is one that has been made already with the being of the we. We must presuppose truth. Dasein itself, as in each case my Dasein and this Dasein, must be, and in the same way the truth, as Dasein's disclosedness, must be. This belongs to Dasein's essential thrownness into the world. Has Dasein as itself ever decided freely whether it wants to come into Dasein or not, and will it ever be able to make such a decision? In itself it is quite incomprehensible why entities are to be uncovered, why truth and Dasein must be. The usual refutation of that skepticism which denies either the being of truth or its cognizability stops halfway. What it shows as a formal argument is simply that if anything gets judged, truth has been presupposed. This suggests that truth belongs to assertion, that pointing something out is, by its very meaning, an uncovering. But when one says this, one has to clarify why that in which there lies the ontological ground for this necessary connection between assertion and truth as regards their being must be as it is. The kind of being which belongs to truth is likewise left completely obscure, and so is the meaning of presupposing, and that of its ontological foundation in Dasein itself. Moreover, one here fails to recognize that even when nobody judges, truth already gets presupposed insofar as Dasein is at all. A skeptic can no more be refuted than the being of truth can be proved. And if any skeptic of the kind who denies the truth factically is, he does not even need to be refuted. Insofar as he is, and has understood himself in this being, he has obliterated Dasein in the desperation of suicide, and in doing so he has also obliterated truth. Because Dasein, for its own part, cannot first be subjected to proof, the necessity of truth cannot be proved either. It has no more been demonstrated that there ever has been an actual skeptic, though this is what has, at bottom, been believed in the refutations of skepticism, in spite of what these undertake to do, than it has been demonstrated that there are any eternal truths. But perhaps such skeptics have been more frequent than one would innocently like to have true, when one tries to bowl over skepticism by formal dialectics. Thus, with the question of the being of truth and the necessity of presupposing it, just as with the question of the essence of knowledge, an ideal subject has generally been posited. The motive for this, whether explicit or tacit, lies in the requirement that philosophy should have the a priori as its theme, rather than empirical facts as such. There is some justification for this requirement, though it still needs to be grounded ontologically. Yet is this requirement satisfied by positing an ideal subject? Is not such a subject a fanciful idealization? With such a conception, have we not missed precisely the a priori character of that merely factual subject, Dasein? Is it not an attribute of the a priori character of the factical subject, that is, an attribute of Dasein's facticity, that it is in the truth and in untruth equi-primordially? The ideas of a pure I, and of a consciousness in general, are so far from including the a priori character of actual subjectivity, that the ontological characters of Dasein's facticity and its state of being are either passed over or not seen at all. Rejection of a consciousness in general does not signify that the a priori is negated, any more than the positing of an idealized subject guarantees that Dasein has an a priori character grounded upon fact. Both the contention that there are eternal truths and the jumbling together of Dasein's phenomenally grounded ideality with an idealized absolute subject belong to those residues of Christian theology within philosophical problematics which have not as yet been radically extruded. The being of truth is connected primordially with Dasein, and only because Dasein is as constituted by disclosedness, that is, by understanding, can anything like being be understood. Only so is it possible to understand being. Being, not entities, is something which there is only so far as truth is, and truth is only insofar as and as long as Dasein is. Being and truth are equi-primordially. What does it signify that being is, where being is to be distinguished from every entity? One can ask this concretely only if the meaning of being and the full scope of the understanding of being have in general been clarified. Only then can one also analyze primordially what belongs to the concept of a science of being as such, and to its possibilities and its variations. And in demarcating this research, and its truth, the kind of research in which entities are uncovered, and its accompanying truth, must be defined ontologically. The answer to the question of the meaning of being has yet to be given, steht aus. What has our fundamental analysis of Dasein, as we have carried it out so far, contributed to working out this question? By laying bare the phenomenon of care, we have clarified the state of being of that entity to whose being something like an understanding of being belongs. At the same time, the being of Dasein has thus been distinguished from modes of being, readiness to hand, presence at hand, reality, which characterize entities with a character other than that of Dasein. Understanding has itself been elucidated, and at the same time the methodological transparency of the procedure of interpreting being, by understanding it and interpreting it, has thus been guaranteed. If in care we have arrived at Dasein's primordial state of being, then this must also be the basis for conceptualizing that understanding of being which lies in care. That is to say, it must be possible to define the meaning of being. But is the phenomenon of care one in which the most primordial existential ontological state of Dasein is disclosed? And has the structural manifoldness which lies in this phenomenon presented us with the most primordial totality of factical Dasein's being? Has our investigation up to this point ever brought Dasein into view as a whole? As a whole. 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 Division 2. Dasein and Temporality. Section 45. The outcome of the preparatory fundamental analysis of Dasein and the task of a primordial existential interpretation of this entity. What have we gained by our preparatory analysis of Dasein, and what are we seeking? In being in the world, whose essential structures center in disclosedness, we have found the basic state of the entity we have taken as our theme. The totality of being in the world as a structural whole has revealed itself as care. In care, the being of Dasein is included. When we came to analyze this being, we took as our clue existence, which, in anticipation, we had designated as the essence of Dasein. This term existence formally indicates that Dasein is, as an understanding, potentiality for being, which in its being makes an issue of that being itself. In every case, I myself am the entity which is in such a manner, der Gestaltseiend. By working out the phenomenon of care, we have given ourselves an insight into the concrete constitution of existence, that is, an insight into its equiprimordial connection with Dasein's facticity and its falling. What we are seeking is the answer to the question about the meaning of being in general, and, prior to that, the possibility of working out in a radical manner this basic question of all ontology. But to lay bare the horizon within which something like being in general becomes intelligible is tantamount to clarifying the possibility of having any understanding of being at all, an understanding which itself belongs to the constitution of the entity called Dasein. The understanding of being, however, cannot be radically clarified as an essential element in Dasein's being, unless the entity to whose being it belongs has been interpreted primordially in itself, with regard to its being. Are we entitled to the claim that in characterizing Dasein ontologically qua care, we have given a primordial interpretation of this entity? By what criterion is the existential analytic of Dasein to be assessed as regards its primordiality, or the lack of it? What indeed do we mean by the primordiality of an ontological interpretation? Ontological investigation is a possible kind of interpreting, which we have described as the working out and appropriation of an understanding. Every interpretation has its forehaving, its foresight, and its foreconception. If such an interpretation as interpretation becomes an explicit task for research, then the totality of these presuppositions, which we call the hermeneutical situation, needs to be clarified and made secure beforehand, both in a basic experience of the object to be disclosed, and in terms of such an experience. In ontological interpretation, an entity is to be laid bare with regard to its own state of being. Such an interpretation obliges us first to give a phenomenal characterization of the entity we have taken as our theme, and thus to bring it into the scope of our forehaving, with which all the subsequent steps of our analysis are to conform. But at the same time, these steps need to be guided by whatever foresight is possible as to the kind of being which the entity may possess. Our forehaving and our foresight will then give us at the same time a sketch of that way of conceiving, or foreconception, to the level of which all structures of being are to be raised. If, however, the ontological interpretation is to be a primordial one, this not only demands that in general the hermeneutical situation shall be one which has been made secure in conformity with the phenomena, it also requires explicit assurance that the whole of the entity, which it has taken as its theme, has been brought into the forehaving. Similarly, it is not enough just to make a first sketch of the being of this entity, even if our sketch is grounded in the phenomena. If we are to have a foresight of being, we must see it in such a way as not to miss the unity of those structural items which belong to it and are possible. Only then can the question of the meaning of the unity which belongs to the whole entity's totality of being be formulated and answered with any phenomenal assurance. Has the existential analysis of Dasein, which we have carried out, arisen from such a hermeneutical situation as will guarantee the primordiality which fundamental ontology demands? Can we progress from the result we have obtained, that the being of Dasein is care, to the question of the primordial unity of this structural whole? What is the status of the foresight by which our ontological procedure has hitherto been guided? We have defined the idea of existence as a potentiality for being, a potentiality which understands, and for which its own being is an issue. But this potentiality for being, as one which is in each case mine, is free either for authenticity or for inauthenticity, or for a mode in which neither of these has been differentiated. In starting with average everydayness, our interpretation has heretofore been confined to the analysis of such existing as is either undifferentiated or inauthentic. Of course, even along this path it was possible and indeed necessary to reach a concrete determination of the existentiality of existence. Nevertheless, our ontological characterization of the constitution of existence still lacked something essential. Existence means a potentiality for being, but also one which is authentic. As long as the existential structure of an authentic potentiality for being has not been brought into the idea of existence, the foresight by which an existential interpretation is guided will lack primordiality. And how about what we have in advance in our hermeneutical situation hitherto? How about its forehaving? When and how has our existential analysis received any assurance that, by starting with everydayness, it has forced the whole of Dasein, this entity from its beginning to its end, into the phenomenological view which gives us our theme? We have indeed contended that care is the totality of the structural whole of Dasein's constitution. But have we not, at the very outset of our interpretation, renounced the possibility of bringing Dasein into view as a whole? Everydayness is precisely that being which is between birth and death. And if existence is definitive for Dasein's being, and if its essence is constituted in part by potentiality for being, then as long as Dasein exists, it must in each case, as such a potentiality, not yet be something. Any entity whose essence is made up of existence is essentially opposed to the possibility of our getting it in our grasp as an entity which is a whole. Not only has the hermeneutical situation hitherto given us no assurance of having the whole entity, one may even question whether having the whole entity is attainable at all, and whether a primordial ontological interpretation of Dasein will not founder on the kind of being which belongs to the very entity we have taken as our theme. One thing has become unmistakable. Our existential analysis of Dasein, up till now, cannot lay claim to primordiality. Its forehaving never included more than the inauthentic being of Dasein, and of Dasein as less than a whole, als Unganzes. If the interpretation of Dasein's being is to become primordial, as a foundation for working out the basic question of ontology, then it must first have brought to light existentially the being of Dasein in its possibilities of authenticity and totality. Thus arises the task of putting Dasein as a whole into our forehaving. This signifies, however, that we must first of all raise the question of this entity's potentiality for being a whole. As long as Dasein is, there is in every case something still outstanding, which Dasein can be and will be. But to that which is thus outstanding the end itself belongs. The end of being in the world is death. This end, which belongs to the potentiality for being, that is to say, to existence, limits and determines, in every case, whatever totality is possible for Dasein. If, however, Dasein's being at an end in death, and therewith its being a whole, are to be included in the discussion of its possibly being a whole, and if this is to be done in a way which is appropriate to the phenomena, then we must have obtained an ontologically adequate conception of death, that is to say, an existential conception of it. But as something of the character of Dasein, death is only in an existentiell being towards death, Sein zum Tode. The existential structure of such being proves to be the ontologically constitutive state of Dasein's potentiality for being a whole. Thus the whole existing Dasein allows itself to be brought into our existential forehaving. But can Dasein also exist authentically as a whole? How is the authenticity of existence to be determined at all, if not with regard to authentic existing? Where do we get our criterion for this? Manifestly, Dasein itself must, in its being, present us with the possibility and the manner of its authentic existence. unless such existence is something that can be imposed upon it ontically or ontologically fabricated. But an authentic potentiality for being is attested by the conscience, and conscience, as a phenomenon of Dasein, demands, like death, a genuinely existential interpretation. Such an interpretation leads to the insight that Dasein has an authentic potentiality for being, in that it wants to have a conscience. But this is an existentiel possibility which tends, from the very meaning of its being, to be made definite in an existentiel way by being towards death. By pointing out that Dasein has an authentic potentiality for being a whole, the existential analytic acquires assurance as to the constitution of Dasein's primordial being. But at the same time, the authentic potentiality for being a whole becomes visible as a mode of care, and therewith the phenomenally adequate ground for a primordial interpretation of the meaning of Dasein's being has also been assured. But the primordial ontological basis for Dasein's existentiality is temporality. In terms of temporality, the articulated structural totality of Dasein's being as care first becomes existentially intelligible. The interpretation of the meaning of Dasein's being cannot stop with this demonstration. The existential temporal analysis of this entity needs to be confirmed concretely. We must go back and lay bare in their temporal meaning the ontological structures of Dasein, which we have previously obtained. Everydayness reveals itself as a mode of temporality. But by thus recapitulating our preparatory fundamental analysis of Dasein, we will at the same time make the phenomenon of temporality itself more transparent. In terms of temporality, it then becomes intelligible why Dasein is, and can be, historical in the basis of its being, and why, as historical, it can develop historiology. If temporality makes up the primordial meaning of Dasein's being, and if, moreover, this entity is one for which, in its being, this very being is an issue, then care must use time, and therefore must reckon with time. Time reckoning is developed by Dasein's temporality. The time which is experienced in such reckoning is that phenomenal aspect of temporality which is closest to us. Out of it arises the ordinary everyday understanding of time, and this understanding evolves into the traditional conception of time. By casting light on the source of the time in which entities within the world are encountered, time as within timeness, we shall make manifest an essential possibility of the temporalizing of temporality. Therewith the understanding prepares itself for an even more primordial temporalizing of temporality. In this is grounded that understanding of being which is constitutive for the being of Dasein. Within the horizon of time, the projection of a meaning of being in general can be accomplished. Thus the investigation, comprised in the division which lies before us, will now traverse the following stages. Dasein's possibility of being a whole and being towards death, Chapter 1. Dasein's attestation of an authentic potentiality for being and resoluteness, Chapter 2. Dasein's authentic potentiality for being a whole, and temporality as the ontological meaning of care, Chapter 3, temporality and everydayness, Chapter 4, temporality and historicality, Chapter 5, temporality and within-timeness as the source of the ordinary conception of time, Chapter 6. Chapter 6. Chapter 6. Division 2. Chapter 1. Dasein's possibility of being a whole, and being towards death. Section 46. The seeming impossibility of getting Dasein's being a whole into our grasp, ontologically and determining its character. The inadequacy of the hermeneutical situation from which the preceding analysis of Dasein has arisen must be surmounted. It is necessary for us to bring the whole Dasein into our forehaving. We must accordingly ask whether this entity, as something existing, can ever become accessible in its being a whole. In Dasein's very state of being, there are important reasons which seem to speak against the possibility of having it presented, Vorgabe, in the manner required. The possibility of this entity's being a whole is manifestly inconsistent with the ontological meaning of care, and care is that which forms the totality of Dasein's structural whole. Yet the primary item in care is the ahead of itself, and this means that in every case Dasein exists for the sake of itself. As long as it is, right to its end, it comports itself towards its potentiality for being. Even when it still exists but has nothing more before it and has settled, abgeschlossen its account, its being is still determined by the ahead of itself. Hopelessness, for instance, does not tear Dasein away from its possibilities, but is only one of its own modes of being towards these possibilities. Even when one is without illusions and is ready for anything, gefasst sein auf alles, here too the ahead of itself lies hidden. The ahead of itself, as an item in the structure of care, tells us unambiguously that in Dasein there is always something still outstanding, which, as a potentiality for being for Dasein itself, has not yet become actual. It is essential to the basic constitution of Dasein that there is constantly something still to be settled, eine ständige Unabgeschlossenheit. Such a lack of totality signifies that there is something still outstanding in one's potentiality for being. But as soon as Dasein exists in such a way that absolutely nothing more is still outstanding in it, then it has already for this very reason become no longer being there, nicht mehr Dasein. Its being is annihilated when what is still outstanding in its being has been liquidated. As long as Dasein is, as an entity, it has never reached its wholeness. But if it gains such wholeness, this gain becomes the utter loss of being in the world. In such a case it can never again be experienced as an entity. The reason for the impossibility of experiencing Dasein ontically as a whole, which is, als Sein des Ganzes, and therefore of determining its character ontologically in its being a whole, does not lie in any imperfection of our cognitive powers. The hindrance lies rather in the being of this entity. That which cannot ever be, such as any experience which pretends to get Dasein in its grasp would claim, eludes in principle any possibility of getting experienced at all. But in that case is it not a hopeless undertaking to try to discern in Dasein its ontological totality of being? We cannot cross out the ahead of itself as an essential item in the structure of care. But how sound are the conclusions which we have drawn from this? Has not the impossibility of getting the whole of Dasein into our grasp been inferred by an argument which is merely formal? Or have we not at bottom inadvertently posited that Dasein is something present at hand, ahead of which something that is not yet present at hand is constantly shoving itself? Have we, in our argument, taken being not yet and the ahead in a sense that is genuinely existential? Has our talk of the end and totality been phenomenally appropriate to Dasein? Has the expression death had a biological signification or one that is existential, ontological? Or indeed any signification that has been adequately and surely delimited? Have we indeed exhausted all the possibilities for making Dasein accessible in its wholeness? We must answer these questions before the problem of Dasein's totality can be dismissed as nugatory, nichtiges. This question, both the existentielle question of whether a potentiality for being a whole is possible, and the existential question of the state of being of end and totality, is one in which there lurks the task of giving a positive analysis for some phenomena of existence which, up till now, have been left aside. In the centre of these considerations we have the task of characterizing ontologically Dasein's being at an end, and of achieving an existential conception of death. The investigations relating to these topics are divided up as follows: the possibility of experiencing the death of others, and the possibility of getting a whole Dasein into our grasp. Section 47. That which is still outstanding, the end and totality. Section 48. how the existential analysis of death is distinguished from other possible interpretations of this phenomenon, section 49, a preliminary sketch of the existential ontological structure of death, section 50, being towards death and the everydayness of Dasein, section 51, everyday being towards death and the full existential conception of death, section 52, an existential projection of an authentic being towards death, section 53. 53. Section 47. The possibility of experiencing the death of others, and the possibility of getting a whole Dasein into our grasp. When Dasein reaches its wholeness in death, it simultaneously loses the being of its there. By its transition to no longer Dasein, nicht mehr Dasein, it gets lifted right out of the possibility of experiencing this transition and of understanding it as something experienced. Surely this sort of thing is denied to any particular Dasein in relation to itself. But this makes the death of others more impressive. In this way a termination, Beendigung of Dasein, becomes objectively accessible. Dasein can thus gain an experience of death, all the more so because Dasein is essentially being with others. In that case, the fact that death has been thus objectively given must make possible an ontological delimitation of Dasein's totality. Thus, from the kind of being which Dasein possesses as being with one another, we might draw the fairly obvious information that when the Dasein of others has come to an end, it might be chosen as a substitute theme for our analysis of Dasein's totality. But does this lead us to our appointed goal? Even the Dasein of others, when it has reached its wholeness in death, is no longer Dasein, in the sense of being no longer in the world. Does not dying mean going out of the world and losing one's being in the world? Yet when someone has died, his being no longer in the world, if we understand it in an extreme way, is still a being, but in the sense of the being just present at hand and no more, of a corporeal thing, which we encounter. In the dying of the other we can experience that remarkable phenomenon of being which may be defined as the changeover of an entity from Dasein's kind of being, or life, to no longer Dasein. The end of the entity, qua Dasein, is the beginning of the same entity, qua something present at hand. However, in this way of interpreting the changeover from Dasein to being just present at hand and no more, the phenomenal content is missed, inasmuch as, in the entity which still remains, we are not presented with a mere corporeal thing. From a theoretical point of view, even the corpse, which is present at hand, is still a possible object for the student of pathological anatomy, whose understanding tends to be oriented to the idea of life. This something which is just present at hand and no more is more than a lifeless material thing. In it we encounter something unalive, which has lost its life. But even this way of characterizing that which still remains, des noch Verbleibenden, does not exhaust the full phenomenal findings with regard to Dasein. The deceased, der Verstorbene, as distinct from the dead person, dem Gestorbenen, has been torn away from those who have remained behind, den Hinterbliebenen, and is an object of concern in the way of funeral rites, interment, and the cult of graves. And that is so because the deceased in his kind of being is still more than just an item of equipment, environmentally ready to hand, about which one can be concerned. In tarrying alongside him in their mourning and commemoration, those who have remained behind are with him, in a mode of respectful solicitude. Thus, the relationship of being which one has towards the dead is not to be taken as a concernful being alongside something ready to hand. In such being with the dead, dem Toten, the deceased himself is no longer factically there. However, when we speak of being with, we always have in view being with one another in the same world. The deceased has abandoned our world, and left it behind. But in terms of that world, aus ihr her, those who remain can still be with him. The greater the phenomenal appropriateness with which we take the no longer Dasein of the deceased, the more plainly is it shown that in such being with the dead, the authentic being come to an end, zu Ende gekommen sein, of the deceased is precisely the sort of thing which we do not experience. Death does indeed reveal itself as a loss, but a loss such as is experienced by those who remain. In suffering this loss, however, we have no way of access to the loss of being as such which the dying man suffers. The dying of others is not something which we experience in a genuine sense. At most we are always just there alongside. And even if, by thus being there alongside, it were possible and feasible for us to make plain to ourselves psychologically the dying of others, this would by no means let us grasp the way to be which we would then have in mind, namely coming to an end. We are asking about the ontological meaning of the dying of the person who dies, as a possibility of being which belongs to his being. We're not asking about the way in which the deceased has Dasein with, or is still a Dasein, noch Daseins, with those who are left behind. If death as experienced in others is what we are enjoined to take as the theme for our analysis of Dasein's end and totality, this cannot give us either ontically or ontologically what it presumes to give. But above all, the suggestion that the dying of others is a substitute theme for the ontological analysis of Dasein's totality, and the settling of its account, rests on a presupposition which demonstrably fails altogether to recognize Dasein's kind of being. This is what one presupposes when one is of the opinion that any Dasein may be substituted for another at random, so that what cannot be experienced in one's own Dasein is accessible in that of a stranger. But is this presupposition actually so baseless? Indisputably, the fact that one Dasein can be represented by another belongs to its possibilities of being with one another in the world. In everyday concern, constant and manifold use is made of such representability. Whenever we go anywhere or have anything to contribute, we can be represented by someone within the range of that environment with which we are most closely concerned. The great multiplicity of ways of being in the world in which one person can be represented by another not only extends to the more refined modes of publicly being with one another, but is likewise germane to those possibilities of concern which are restricted within definite ranges, and which are cut to the measure of one's occupation, one's social status, or one's age. But the very meaning of such representation is such that it is always a representation in und by, something, that is to say, in concerning oneself with something. But proximally and for the most part, everyday Dasein understands itself in terms of that with which it is customarily concerned. One is what one does. In relation to this sort of being, the everyday manner in which we join with one another in absorption in the world of our concern, representability is not only quite possible, but is even constitutive for our being with one another. Here one Dasein can and must, within certain limits, be another Dasein. However, this possibility of representing breaks down completely if the issue is one of representing that possibility of being which makes up Dasein's coming to an end, and which as such gives to it its wholeness. No one can take the other's dying away from him. Of course, someone can go to his death for another, but that always means to sacrifice oneself for the other, in some definite affair. Such dying for can never signify that the other has thus had his death taken away, in even the slightest degree. Dying is something that every Dasein itself must take upon itself at the time. By its very essence, death is in every case mine, insofar as it is at all, and indeed death signifies a peculiar possibility of being in which the very being of one's own Dasein is an issue. In dying it is shown that mineness and existence are ontologically constitutive for death. Dying is not an event. It is a phenomenon to be understood existentially, and it is to be understood in a distinctive sense which must be still more closely delimited. But if ending as dying is constitutive for Dasein's totality, then the being of this wholeness itself must be conceived as an existential phenomenon of a Dasein, which is in each case one's own. In ending and in Dasein's being a whole, for which such ending is constitutive, there is by its very essence no representing. These are the facts of the case existentially. One fails to recognize this when one interposes the expedient of making the dying of others a substitute theme for the analysis of totality. So once again, the attempt to make Dasein's being a whole accessible in a way that is appropriate to the phenomena has broken down. But our deliberations have not been negative in their outcome. They have been oriented by the phenomena, even if only rather roughly. We have indicated that death is an existential phenomenon. Our investigation is thus forced into a purely existential orientation to the Dasein, which is in every case one's own. The only remaining possibility for the analysis of death as dying is either to form a purely existential conception of this phenomenon, or else to forego any ontological understanding of it. When we characterize the transition from Dasein to no longer Dasein as being no longer in the world, we showed further that Dasein's going out of the world in the sense of dying must be distinguished from the going out of the world of that which merely has life, des nur Lebenden. In our terminology, the ending of anything that is alive is denoted as perishing, verenden. We can see the difference only if the kind of ending which Dasein can have is distinguished from the end of a life. Of course, dying may also be taken physiologically and biologically, but the medical concept of the exitus does not coincide with that of perishing. From the foregoing discussion of the ontological possibility of getting death into our grasp, it becomes clear at the same time that substructures of entities with another kind of being, presence at hand or life, thrust themselves to the fore unnoticed, and threaten to bring confusion to the interpretation of this phenomenon, even to the first suitable way of presenting it. We can encounter this phenomenon only by seeking, for our further analysis, an ontologically adequate way of defining the phenomena which are constitutive for it, such as end and totality. Section 48. That which is still outstanding. The end, totality. Within the framework of this investigation, our ontological characterization of the end and totality can be only provisional. To perform this task adequately, we must not only set forth the formal structure of end in general and of totality in general. We must likewise disentangle the structural variations which are possible for them in different realms. That is to say, deformalized variations which have been put into relationship, respectively, with definite kinds of entities as subject matter, and which have had their character determined in terms of the being of these entities. This task, in turn, presupposes that a sufficiently unequivocal and positive interpretation shall have been given for the kinds of being which require that the aggregate of entities be divided into such realms. But if we are to understand these ways of being, we need a clarified idea of being in general. The task of carrying out in an appropriate way the ontological analysis of end and totality breaks down not only because the theme is so far-reaching, but because there is a difficulty in principle. To master this task successfully, we must presuppose that precisely what we are seeking in this investigation, the meaning of being in general, is something which we have found already, and with which we are quite familiar. In the following considerations, the variations in which we are chiefly interested are those of end and totality. These are ways in which Dasein gets a definite character ontologically, and as such they should lead to a primordial interpretation of this entity. Keeping constantly in view the existential constitution of Dasein already set forth, we must try to decide how inappropriate to Dasein ontologically are those conceptions of end and totality which first thrust themselves to the fore, no matter how categorically indefinite they may remain. The rejection, Zurückweisung, of such concepts must be developed into a positive assignment, Zuweisung, of them to their specific realms. In this way, our understanding of end and totality in their variant forms as existentialia will be strengthened, and this will guarantee the possibility of an ontological interpretation of death. But even if the analysis of Dasein's end and totality takes on so broad an orientation, this cannot mean that the existential concepts of end and totality are to be obtained by way of a deduction. On the contrary, the existential meaning of Dasein's coming to an end must be taken from Dasein itself, and we must show how such ending can constitute being a whole for the entity which exists. We may formulate in 3 theses the discussion of death up to this point. 1. There belongs to Dasein, as long as it is, a not yet, which it will be, that which is constantly still outstanding. 2. The coming to its end of what is not yet at an end, in which what is still outstanding is liquidated as regards its being, has the character of no longer Dasein. 3. Coming to an end implies a mode of being in which the particular Dasein simply cannot be represented by someone else. In Dasein there is undeniably a constant lack of totality which finds an end with death. This not yet belongs to Dasein as long as it is. This is how things stand phenomenally. Is this to be interpreted as still outstanding? With relation to what entities do we talk about that which is still outstanding? When we use this expression, we have in view that which indeed belongs to an entity but is still missing. Outstanding, as a way of being missing, is grounded upon a belonging to. For instance, the remainder, yet to be received when a debt is to be balanced off, is still outstanding. That which is still outstanding is not yet at one's disposal. When the debt gets paid off, that which is still outstanding gets liquidated. This signifies that the money comes in, or, in other words, that the remainder comes successively along. By this procedure, the not yet gets filled up, as it were, until the sum that is owed is all together. Therefore, to be still outstanding means that what belongs together is not yet all together. Ontologically, this implies the unreadiness to hand of those portions which have yet to be contributed. These portions have the same kind of being as those which are ready to hand already, and the latter, for their part, do not have their kind of being modified by having the remainder come in. Whatever lack of togetherness remains, das bestehende Unzusammen, gets paid off by a cumulative piecing together. Entities for which anything is still outstanding have the kind of being of something ready to hand. The togetherness, das Zusammen, is characterized as a sum, and so is that lack of togetherness which is founded upon it. But this lack of togetherness which belongs to such a mode of togetherness, this being missing as still outstanding, cannot by any means define ontologically that not yet which belongs to Dasein as its possible death. Dasein does not have at all the kind of being of something ready to hand within the world. The togetherness of an entity of the kind which Dasein is in running its course, until that course has been completed, is not constituted by a continuing piecing on of entities which, somehow and somewhere, are ready to hand already in their own right. That Dasein should be together only when its not yet has been filled up is so far from the case that it is precisely then that Dasein is no longer. Any Dasein always exists in just such a manner that its not yet belongs to it. But are there not entities which are as they are, and to which a not yet can belong, but which do not necessarily have Dasein's kind of being? For instance, we can say, the last quarter is still outstanding until the moon gets full. The not yet diminishes as the concealing shadow disappears. But here the moon is always present at hand, as a whole already. Leaving aside the fact that we can never get the moon wholly in our grasp even when it is full, this not yet does not in any way signify a not yet being together of the parts which belongs to the moon, but pertains only to the way we get it in our grasp perceptually. The not yet which belongs to Dasein, however, is not just something which is provisionally and occasionally inaccessible to one's own experience, or even to that of a stranger, it is not yet actual at all. Our problem does not pertain to getting into our grasp the not yet, which is of the character of Dasein. It pertains to the possible being or not being of this not yet. Dasein must, as itself, become, that is to say, be what it is not yet. Thus, if we are to be able, by comparison, to define that being of the not yet which is of the character of Dasein, we must take into consideration entities to whose kind of being becoming belongs. When, for instance, a fruit is unripe, it goes towards its ripeness. In this process of ripening, that which the fruit is not yet is by no means pieced on as something not yet present at hand. The fruit brings itself to ripeness, and such a bringing of itself is a characteristic of its being as a fruit. Nothing imaginable which one might contribute to it would eliminate the unripeness of the fruit if this entity did not come to ripeness of its own accord. When we speak of the not yet of the unripeness, we do not have in view something else which stands outside, Außenstehendes, and which, with utter indifference to the fruit, might be present at hand, in it and with it. What we have in view is the fruit itself in its specific kind of being. The sum, which is not yet complete, is, as something ready to hand, a matter of indifference, as regards the remainder which is lacking and unready to hand. Though, taken strictly, it can neither be indifferent to that remainder nor not be indifferent to it. The ripening fruit, however, not only is not indifferent to its unripeness as something other than itself, but it is that unripeness as it ripens. The not yet has already been included in the very being of the fruit, not as some random characteristic, but as something constitutive. Correspondingly, as long as any Dasein is, it, too, is already its not yet. That which makes up the lack of totality in Dasein, the constant ahead of itself, is neither something still outstanding in a summative togetherness, nor something which has not yet become accessible. It is a not yet, which any Dasein, as the entity which it is, has to be. Nevertheless, the comparison with the unripeness of the fruit shows essential differences, although there is a certain agreement. If we take note of these differences, we shall recognize how indefinite our talk about the end and ending has hitherto been. Ripening is the specific being of the fruit. It is also a kind of being of the not yet, of unripeness. And as such a kind of being, it is formally analogous to Dasein, in that the latter, like the former, is in every case already its not yet, in a sense still to be defined. But even then, this does not signify that ripeness as an end and death as an end coincide with regard to their ontological structure as ends. With ripeness, the fruit fulfills itself. But is the death at which Dasein arrives a fulfillment in this sense? With its death, Dasein has indeed fulfilled its course, but in doing so has it necessarily exhausted its specific possibilities. Rather, are not these precisely what gets taken away from Dasein? Even unfulfilled Dasein ends. On the other hand, so little is it the case that Dasein comes to its ripeness only with death, that Dasein may well have passed its ripeness before the end. For the most part, Dasein ends in unfulfillment, or else by having disintegrated and being used up. Ending does not necessarily mean fulfilling oneself. It thus becomes more urgent to ask in what sense, if any, death must be conceived as the ending of Dasein. In the first instance, ending signifies stopping, and it signifies this in senses which are ontologically different. The rain stops. It is no longer present at hand. The road stops. Such an ending does not make the road disappear, but such a stopping is determinative for the road as this one, which is present at hand. Hence ending as stopping can signify either passing over into non-presence at hand, or else being present at hand only when the end comes. The latter kind of ending in turn may either be determinative for something which is present at hand in an unfinished way, as a road breaks off when one finds it under construction, or it may rather constitute the finishedness of something present at hand, as the painting is finished with the last stroke of the brush. But ending, as getting finished, does not include fulfilling. On the other hand, whatever has got to be fulfilled must indeed reach the finishedness that is possible for it. Fulfilling is a mode of finishedness, and is founded upon it. Finishedness is itself possible only as a determinate form of something present at hand, or ready to hand. Even ending in the sense of disappearing can still have its modifications according to the kind of being which an entity may have. The rain is at an end, that is to say, it has disappeared. The bread is at an end, that is to say, it has been used up, and is no longer available as something ready to hand. By none of these modes of ending can death be suitably characterized as the end of Dasein. If dying as being at an end were understood in the sense of an ending of the kind we have discussed, then Dasein would thereby be treated as something present at hand or ready to hand. In death, Dasein has not been fulfilled, nor has it simply disappeared. It has not become finished, nor is it wholly at one's disposal as something ready to hand. On the contrary, just as Dasein is already its not yet, and is its not yet constantly as long as it is already its end too. The ending which we have in view when we speak of death does not signify Dasein's being at an end, zu Ende sein, but a being towards the end, sein zum Ende, of this entity. Death is a way to be which Dasein takes over as soon as it is. As soon as man comes to life, he is at once old enough to die. Ending as being towards the end must be clarified ontologically in terms of Dasein's kind of being, and presumably the possibility of an existent being of that not yet, which lies before the end, will become intelligible only if the character of ending has been determined existentially. The existential clarification of being towards the end will also give us, for the first time, an adequate basis for defining what can possibly be the meaning of our talk about a totality of Dasein, if indeed this totality is to be constituted by death as the end. Our attempt to understand Dasein's totality by taking as our point of departure a clarification of the not yet, and going on to a characterization of ending, has not led us to our goal. It has shown only in a negative way that the not yet, which Dasein in every case is, resists interpretation as something still outstanding. The end towards which Dasein is, as existing, remains inappropriately defined by the notion of a being at an end. These considerations, however, should at the same time make it plain that they must be turned back in their course. A positive characterization of the phenomena in question, being not yet, ending totality, succeeds only when it is unequivocally oriented to Dasein's state of being. But if we have any insight into the realms where those end structures and totality structures, which are to be construed ontologically with Dasein, belong, this will, in a negative way, make this unequivocal character secure against wrong turnings. If we are to carry out a positive interpretation of death and its character as an end, by way of existential analysis, we must take as our clue the basic state of Dasein at which we have already arrived, the phenomenon of care. The phenomenon of care. The phenomenon of care. Section 49. How the existential analysis of death is distinguished from other possible interpretations of this phenomenon. The unequivocal character of our ontological interpretation of death must first be strengthened by our bringing explicitly to mind what such an interpretation can not inquire about, and what it would be vain to expect it to give us any information or instructions about. Death, in the widest sense, is a phenomenon of life. Life must be understood as a kind of being to which there belongs a being in the world. Only if this kind of being is oriented in a privative way to Dasein can we fix its character ontologically. Even Dasein may be considered purely as life. When the question is formulated from the viewpoint of biology and physiology, Dasein moves into that domain of being which we know as the world of animals and plants. In this field we can obtain data and statistics about the longevity of plants, animals and men, and we do this by ascertaining them ontically. Connections between longevity, propagation, and growth may be recognized. The kinds of death, the causes, contrivances, and ways in which it makes its entry can be explored. Underlying this biological, ontical exploration of death is a problematic that is ontological. We still have to ask how the ontological essence of death is defined in terms of that of life. In a certain way, this has always been decided already in the ontical investigation of death. Such investigations operate with preliminary conceptions of life and death which have been more or less clarified. These preliminary conceptions need to be sketched out by the ontology of Dasein. Within the ontology of Dasein, which is superordinate to an ontology of life, the existential analysis of death is in turn subordinate to a characterization of Dasein's basic state. The ending of that which lives we have called perishing. Dasein too has its death, of the kind appropriate to anything that lives. And it has it not in ontical isolation, but as co-determined by its primordial kind of being. Insofar as this is the case, Dasein too can end without authentically dying, though on the other hand, qua Dasein, it does not simply perish. We designate this intermediate phenomenon as its demise. Let the term dying stand for that way of being in which Dasein is towards its death. Accordingly, we must say that Dasein never perishes. Dasein, however, can demise only as long as it is dying. Medical and biological investigation into demising can obtain results which may even become significant ontologically if the basic orientation for an existential interpretation of death has been made secure. Or must sickness and death in general, even from a medical point of view, be primarily conceived as existential phenomena? The existential interpretation of death takes precedence over any biology and ontology of life. But it is also the foundation for any investigation of death which is biographical or historiological, ethnological or psychological. In any typology of dying, as a characterization of the conditions under which a demise is experienced, and of the ways in which it is experienced, the concept of death is already presupposed. Moreover, a psychology of dying gives information about the living of the person who is dying, rather than about dying itself. This simply reflects the fact that when Dasein dies, and even when it dies authentically, it does not have to do so with an experience of its factical demising, or in such an experience. Likewise, the ways in which death is taken among primitive peoples and their ways of comporting themselves towards it in magic and cult illuminate primarily the understanding of Dasein. But the interpretation of this understanding already requires an existential analytic, and a corresponding conception of death. On the other hand, in the ontological analysis of being towards the end, there is no anticipation of our taking any existential stand towards death. If death is defined as the end of Dasein, that is to say, of being in the world, this does not imply any ontical decision whether, after death, still another being is possible, either higher or lower, or whether Dasein lives on or even outlasts itself and is immortal. Nor is anything decided ontically about the otherworldly and its possibility, any more than about the this-worldly. It is not as if norms and rules for comporting oneself towards death were to be proposed for edification. But our analysis of death remains purely this-worldly, insofar as it interprets that phenomenon merely in the way in which it enters into any particular Dasein as a possibility of its being. Only when death is conceived in its full ontological essence can we have any methodological assurance in even asking what may be after death. Only then can we do so with meaning and justification. Whether such a question is a possible theoretical question at all will not be decided here. This worldly ontological interpretation of death takes precedence over any ontical otherworldly speculation. Finally, what might be discussed under the topic of a metaphysic of death lies outside the domain of an existential analysis of death. Questions of how and when death came into the world, what meaning it can have, and is to have as an evil and affliction in the aggregate of entities, these are questions which necessarily presuppose an understanding not only of the character of being which belongs to death, but of the ontology of the aggregate of entities as a whole, and especially of the ontological clarification of evil and negativity in general. Methodologically, the existential analysis is superordinate to the questions of a biology, psychology, theodicy or theology of death. Taken ontically, the results of the analysis show the peculiar formality and emptiness of any ontological characterization. However, that must not blind us to the rich and complicated structure of the phenomenon. If Dasein in general never becomes accessible as something present at hand, because being possible belongs in its own way to Dasein's kind of being, even less may we expect that we can simply read off the ontological structure of death, if death is indeed a distinctive possibility of Dasein. On the other hand, the analysis cannot keep clinging to an idea of death which has been devised accidentally and at random. We can restrain this arbitrariness only by giving beforehand an ontological characterization of the kind of being in which the end enters into Dasein's average everydayness. To do so, we must fully envisage those structures of everydayness which we have earlier set forth. The fact that in an existential analysis of death, existentielle possibilities of being towards death are consonant with it is implied by the essence of all ontological investigation. All the more explicitly must the existential definition of concepts be unaccompanied by any existentielle commitments, especially with relation to death, in which Dasein's character as possibility lets itself be revealed most precisely. The existential problematic aims only at setting forth the ontological structure of Dasein's being towards the end. Section 50. Preliminary sketch of the existential ontological structure of death. From our considerations of totality, end, and that which is still outstanding, there has emerged the necessity of interpreting the phenomenon of death as being towards the end, and of doing so in terms of Dasein's basic state. Only so can it be made plain to what extent being a whole, as constituted by being towards the end, is possible in Dasein itself, in conformity with the structure of its being. We have seen that care is the basic state of Dasein. The ontological signification of the expression care has been expressed in the definition ahead of itself being already in the world, as being alongside entities which we encounter within the world. In this are expressed the fundamental characteristics of Dasein's being: existence in the ahead of itself, facticity in the being already in, falling in the being alongside. If indeed death belongs in a distinctive sense to the being of Dasein, then death, or being towards the end, must be defined in terms of these characteristics. We must in the first instance make plain in a preliminary sketch how Dasein's existence, facticity, and falling reveal themselves in the phenomenon of death. The interpretation in which the not yet, and with it even the uttermost not yet, the end of Dasein, was taken in the sense of something still outstanding, has been rejected as inappropriate in that it included the ontological perversion of making Dasein something present at hand. Being at an end implies existentially being towards the end. The uttermost not yet has the character of something towards which Dasein comports itself. The end is impending, steht bevor, for Dasein. Death is not something not yet present at hand, nor is it that which is ultimately still outstanding, but which has been reduced to a minimum. Death is something that stands before us, something impending. However, there is much that can impend for Dasein as being in the world. The character of impendence is not distinctive of death. On the contrary, this interpretation could even lead us to suppose that death must be understood in the sense of some impending event encountered environmentally. For instance, a storm, the remodeling of the house, or the arrival of a friend may be impending. And these are entities which are respectively present at hand, ready to hand and there with us. The death which impends does not have this kind of being. But there may also be impending for Dasein a journey, for instance, or a disputation with others, or the foregoing of something of a kind which Dasein itself can be, its own possibilities of being, which are based on its being with others. Death is a possibility of being which Dasein itself has to take over in every case. With death, Dasein stands before itself in its ownmost potentiality for being. This is a possibility in which the issue is nothing less than Dasein's being in the world. Its death is the possibility of no longer being able to be there. If Dasein stands before itself as this possibility, it has been fully assigned to its ownmost potentiality for being. When it stands before itself in this way, all its relations to any other Dasein have been undone. This ownmost non-relational possibility is at the same time the uttermost one. As potentiality for being, Dasein cannot outstrip the possibility of death. Death is the possibility of the absolute impossibility of Dasein. Thus, death reveals itself as that possibility which is one's ownmost, which is non-relational and which is not to be outstripped, unüberholbare. As such, death is something distinctively impending. Its existential possibility is based on the fact that Dasein is essentially disclosed to itself, and disclosed, indeed, as ahead of itself. This item in the structure of care has its most primordial concretion in being towards death. As a phenomenon, being towards the end becomes plainer as being towards that distinctive possibility of Dasein which we have characterized. This ownmost possibility, however, non-relational and not to be outstripped, is not one which Dasein procures for itself subsequently and occasionally in the course of its being. On the contrary, if Dasein exists, it has already been thrown into this possibility. Dasein does not, proximally and for the most part, have any explicit or even any theoretical knowledge of the fact that it has been delivered over to its death, and that death thus belongs to being in the world. Thrownness into death reveals itself to Dasein in a more primordial and impressive manner, in that state of mind which we have called anxiety. Anxiety in the face of death is anxiety in the face of that potentiality for being which is one's ownmost, non-relational, and not to be outstripped. That in the face of which one has anxiety is being in the world itself. That about which one has this anxiety is simply Dasein's potentiality for being. Anxiety in the face of death must not be confused with fear in the face of one's demise. This anxiety is not an accidental or random mood of weakness in some individual, but as a basic state of mind of Dasein, it amounts to the disclosedness of the fact that Dasein exists as thrown being towards its end. Thus, the existential conception of dying is made clear as thrown being towards its ownmost potentiality for being, which is non-relational and not to be outstripped. Precision is gained by distinguishing this from pure disappearance, and also from merely perishing, and finally from the experiencing of a demise. Being towards the end does not first arise through some attitude which occasionally emerges, nor does it arise as such an attitude. It belongs essentially to Dasein's thrownness, which reveals itself in a state of mind, mood, in one way or another. The factical knowledge or ignorance which prevails in any Dasein as to its ownmost being towards the end is only the expression of the existentielle possibility that there are different ways of maintaining oneself in this being. Factically, there are many who, proximally and for the most part, do not know about death. But this must not be passed off as a ground for proving that being towards death does not belong to Dasein universally. It only proves that proximally and for the most part, Dasein covers up its ownmost being towards death, fleeing in the face of it. Factically, Dasein is dying as long as it exists, but proximally and for the most part it does so by way of falling. For factical existing is not only generally and without further differentiation a thrown potentiality for being in the world, but it has always likewise been absorbed in the world of its concern. In this falling, being alongside, fleeing from uncanniness announces itself, and this means now a fleeing in the face of one's ownmost being towards death. Existence, facticity, and falling characterize being towards the end, and are therefore constitutive for the existential conception of death. As regards its ontological possibility, dying is grounded in care. But if being towards death belongs primordially and essentially to Dasein's being, then it must also be exhibitable in everydayness, even if proximally in a way which is inauthentic. And if being towards the end should afford the existential possibility of an existentielle, being a whole for Dasein, then this would give phenomenal confirmation for the thesis that care is the ontological term for the totality of Dasein's structural whole. If, however, we are to provide a full phenomenal justification for this principle, a preliminary sketch of the connection between being towards death and care is not sufficient. We must be able to see this connection above all in that concretion which lies closest to Dasein, its everydayness.